a desolate stretch of Florida highway, shrouded in darkness. The amber glow of headlights cuts through the night as an unsuspecting man pulls over for what he believes will be a brief encounter. But lurking in the shadows is America's first female serial killer, a predator who turned the tables on her prey in the most horrifying way imaginable. This is the blood-soaked story of Aileen Wuornos, the highway huntress who left a trail of 7 mutilated corpses across Florida's forgotten backroads. Tonight, we descend into the twisted mind of a killer whose rage knew no bounds, whose brutality shocked even seasoned investigators, and whose reign of terror transformed lonely highways into hunting grounds of death. Welcome to Crime Headquarters. We know many of you turn to these stories to unwind, but tonight, you're in for something truly chilling and tragic. So, settle in, whether you're lying in bed or sitting in your favorite chair, and let the weight of the day slip away. Before you dive in, make sure to subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and prepare yourself. You're about to hear the raw and disturbing details of a crime that shocked the world. Ready? Let's begin. In the suffocating heat of a Michigan winter in 1956, evil took its first breath in the form of Aileen Carol Pittman. Born into a world that seemed determined to destroy her before she could destroy others, this screaming infant would grow to become one of history's most terrifying predators. A woman whose name would be whispered in the same breath as Bundy, Dahmer, and Gacy. The house on Cadmus Street in Rochester, Michigan, was a fortress of dysfunction, where violence was currency and cruelty was commonplace. Aileen's father, Leo Dale Pittman, was already rotting away in a Kansas prison for kidnapping and sodomizing a 7-year-old child when she drew her first breath. The genetic lottery had already been rigged against her, the DNA of a monster coursing through her tiny veins like liquid poison. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, was little more than a teenager herself, already drowning in the quicksand of her own demons. At 17, she was trapped in a marriage to a pedophile, saddled with children she couldn't care for, and spiraling into a darkness that would consume everything in its path. The house reeked of cigarette smoke, stale beer, and something far more sinister: the acrid stench of despair that clung to the walls like a malignant tumor. When Aileen was just 4 years old, her biological father's twisted legacy caught up with him in the most final way possible. Leo Dale Pittman wrapped a bedsheet around his neck in his prison cell and stepped into oblivion, leaving behind a daughter who would inherit his appetite for violence and his complete disregard for human life. Death had claimed her father, but it had also planted the first seeds of what would become an unstoppable killing machine. Diane couldn't handle the suffocating weight of motherhood, and she abandoned her children like discarded trash on the doorstep of their maternal grandparents. Aileen and her brother Keith were left in the care of Lori and Britta Wuornos, a couple whose idea of child-rearing involved leather belts, closed fists, and psychological torture that would make seasoned interrogators flinch. The Wuornos household was a chamber of horrors disguised as suburban normalcy. Lori Wuornos was a Finnish immigrant with hands like sledgehammers and a temper that could ignite without warning. He ruled his domain through fear, using his massive frame to intimidate anyone who dared challenge his authority. His wife Britta was complicit in the abuse, a silent accomplice who watched as her husband systematically destroyed 2 innocent children. Aileen's childhood was a relentless parade of beatings that left her body covered in bruises like a roadmap of suffering. Lori would use anything within reach as a weapon: belts, extension cords, his bare hands, whatever would inflict the maximum amount of pain without leaving permanent scars that might attract unwanted attention from neighbors or teachers. The basement became her personal hell, where she would be locked away for days at a time, left to contemplate her worthlessness in the suffocating darkness. But the physical abuse was nothing compared to the psychological warfare that raged within those walls. Lori would tell her repeatedly that she was unwanted, unloved, and destined for nothing but failure and misery. He would describe in vivid detail how her father was a perverted monster who had defiled innocent children, making sure she understood that the same evil blood flowed through her veins. These verbal assaults were like acid poured directly onto her developing psyche, eating away at any possibility of normal emotional development. School offered no refuge from the nightmare. Aline was the weird kid, the one who showed up with mysterious bruises and hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through you. She was already displaying the classic signs of a developing psychopath: cruelty to animals, an inability to form meaningful relationships, and an explosive temper that could detonate without warning. Teachers noticed her disturbing behavior but did nothing to intervene, allowing the monster to continue growing in the shadows. By age 11, Aileen had discovered that her body could be used as currency in the twisted economy of her neighborhood. She began trading sexual favors for cigarettes, alcohol, and drugs, anything that could numb the constant pain that gnawed at her insides like a parasitic worm. The grown men who took advantage of her didn't care that she was just a child. They saw an opportunity and seized it with predatory enthusiasm. Her first taste of violence came when she was just 14, during one of these degrading encounters. A man had refused to pay her agreed-upon fee, and something inside her snapped like a twig under pressure. She grabbed a broken beer bottle and slashed his face open, watching with fascination as blood poured down his cheeks like crimson tears. The rush of power she felt in that moment was intoxicating, better than any drug she had ever tried. For the first time in her miserable existence, she wasn't the victim. She was the predator. The transformation had begun. School became an impossibility as Aileen spiraled deeper into a world of prostitution, drugs, and violence. She dropped out and hit the streets full-time, selling her body to truckers, businessmen, and anyone else with $20 and a complete lack of moral compass. But even in this degraded existence, she was planning her revenge against a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. When Britta Wernos died of liver failure, her body finally succumbing to years of alcohol abuse and stress, Aileen saw an opportunity for escape. She convinced Lori to sign over legal guardianship to her, then immediately used her newfound freedom to disappear into the night like a malevolent spirit returning to the shadows. At 19, she was already a hardened criminal with a rap sheet that read like a catalog of human depravity. Armed robbery, assault, grand theft auto. She collected charges like trophies, each one another step on her journey toward becoming America's most feared female predator. The scared little girl who had cowered in basements and endured unspeakable abuse was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. A woman with absolutely nothing left to lose. Florida beckoned like a siren's call, promising warm weather and endless highways filled with potential victims. Aileen packed her few belongings and headed south, leaving behind a trail of broken bones, shattered lives, and police reports. She had no way of knowing that she was about to enter the killing fields that would make her immortal in the annals of criminal history. The stage was set for a bloodbath that would terrorize an entire state. 7 men would die screaming her name, their bodies left to rot under the merciless Florida sun. But that was still years away, and first Aileen Wernos needed to perfect her craft. She needed to learn how to hunt, how to kill, and how to disappear without a trace. The monster was fully formed, and she was hungry for blood. As her battered Pontiac crossed the Georgia-Florida state line in 1976, Aileen Carol Wernos smiled for the first time in years. She had found her hunting ground, and soon, very soon, she would begin her masterpiece of murder and mayhem. The highways of Florida were about to run red with blood, and America's first female serial killer was ready to claim her throne built on corpses and carved from pure malevolence. The killing would begin in earnest, and when it did, hell itself would seem like a vacation compared to the nightmare Aileen Wernos was about to unleash upon the world. Florida's highways in the late 1980s were arteries of death waiting for the right predator to claim them. Stretching endlessly through palmetto scrublands and pine forests, these desolate roads became hunting grounds for America's most vicious female killer. Interstate 75, U.S. Highway 19, State Road 40. Each mile marker would soon be stained with blood, each rest stop transformed into a potential crime scene where screams echoed through Spanish moss before dissolving into the suffocating humidity. Aileen Wernos had found her kingdom of carnage. By 1989, she had perfected her predatory technique through years of brutal trial and error. Standing on the shoulder of darkened highways, she would flag down unsuspecting motorists with the practiced desperation of a woman in distress. Her weathered face and disheveled appearance sold the illusion perfectly. Here was a vulnerable female in need of rescue, triggering the protective instincts that would seal her victim's doom. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lurked something far more sinister. A killing machine fueled by decades of rage, armed with a .22 caliber pistol, and possessed by an insatiable hunger for revenge against every man who had ever wronged her. The scared little girl from Michigan was gone, replaced by a predator whose brutality would shock even hardened homicide investigators. December 1st, 1989. The date would be forever etched in blood across the criminal history of Florida. Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics store owner, was driving his 1977 Cadillac Coupe de Ville along Interstate 95 when he spotted a woman frantically waving from the roadside. Something primal in his brain, the same instinct that had protected his species for millennia, screamed danger, but his conscious mind overrode the warning. She looked helpless, desperate, alone. It was the last mistake he would ever make. Mallory pulled over, his headlights cutting through the December darkness like twin beacons illuminating his own execution. Eileen approached the passenger side window with the practiced gait of a prostitute, her hips swaying slightly, her voice dripping with false vulnerability as she negotiated the terms of what he believed would be a simple business transaction. $20 for oral sex in a secluded location off the main road. Mallory agreed, his blood already rushing south as he contemplated the evening's entertainment. But Eileen had no intention of providing any services. As Mallory drove deeper into the Palmetto wilderness, following her directions toward what he thought would be a discreet spot for their encounter, she was calculating the precise moment to strike. Her right hand rested casually near her purse, fingers already curled around the grip of her pistol, like a spider preparing to inject venom. "Stop here," she commanded when they reached a particularly isolated section of Volusia County, surrounded by dense vegetation that would muffle any sounds of struggle. Mallory complied, parking his Cadillac in a small clearing where the moonlight filtered through the canopy like silver blood dripping from skeletal branches. What happened next would become Eileen's signature, a level of brutality that transcended simple murder and entered the realm of pure evil. As Mallory reached for his wallet, expecting to pay for services rendered, Eileen drew her weapon with the speed and precision of a trained executioner. The .22 caliber bullet tore through his chest, puncturing his lung and sending him into convulsions of agony. But she wasn't finished, not even close. As Mallory writhed in the driver's seat, blood bubbling from his lips as he gasped for air that his perforated lung could no longer process, Eileen continued her assault. She fired again, the second bullet shattering his ribs and tearing through vital organs. Then a third shot, this one aimed with surgical precision at his heart, finally silencing his desperate pleas for mercy. The Cadillac's interior was now painted in crimson, the metallic smell of blood mixing with the acrid smoke from discharged gunpowder. But Eileen wasn't satisfied with simple death. She needed to send a message, to transform this killing into a work of twisted art that would terrify anyone who discovered it. She dragged Mallory's lifeless corpse from the vehicle, his body leaving a trail of blood across the sandy ground like a grotesque paintbrush stroke. Using a hunting knife she had purchased specifically for this purpose, she began to mutilate the body with the methodical precision of a butcher. Deep gashes across the chest, puncture wounds in the abdomen, and finally, the piece de resistance. She carved her initials into his forehead, marking her territory with the same casual efficiency that a dog marks a fire hydrant. The psychological satisfaction she derived from this desecration was beyond description. Every cut of the blade was revenge for every beating she had endured, every act of humiliation she had suffered, every moment of powerlessness that had defined her miserable existence. Richard Mallory's corpse became a canvas for her rage, and she painted it with the enthusiasm of a deranged artist finally given the opportunity to express her true vision. She stripped the body completely, not for any sexual gratification, but to increase the victim's degradation and make identification more difficult. The clothes were scattered throughout the palmetto scrub like grotesque party favors, while Mallory's wallet and other valuables went into her purse. Not because she needed the money, but because taking trophies was an essential part of her psychological reward system. The Cadillac was abandoned in a different location, wiped clean of fingerprints but deliberately left where it would eventually be discovered. Eileen wanted the authorities to find it, wanted them to know that something unprecedented was stalking Florida's highways. She was announcing her presence to the world, declaring war on every man who dared to venture onto her hunting grounds. As she walked away from the crime scene, her boots crunching on pine needles still wet with her victim's blood, Eileen felt a euphoria unlike anything she had ever experienced. The killing had been perfect, brutal, efficient, and deeply satisfying on a level that normal people could never comprehend. She had finally found her true calling, her purpose in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. Richard Mallory's body was discovered 3 days later by a hunter whose dog had been attracted by the smell of decomposition. The hunter's screams could be heard for miles as he stumbled backward from the mutilated corpse, his mind unable to process the level of savagery that had been inflicted upon another human being. The subsequent police investigation would reveal evidence of torture that made seasoned investigators physically ill, professional men who had seen every conceivable form of human evil but had never encountered anything quite like this. But this was just the beginning. Eileen had tasted blood, and the hunger was growing stronger with each passing day. 7 victims would follow Richard Mallory into their graves, each death more brutal than the last, each crime scene more horrifying than anything Florida law enforcement had ever encountered. The highway huntress had claimed her first trophy, and she was already planning her next kill. The roads of Florida would never be safe again, and somewhere in the darkness, a monster was smiling as she counted the bullets remaining in her gun. 6 more chances to perfect her craft, 6 more opportunities to paint the highways red with blood and terror. The massacre had only just begun. In the weeks following Mallory's murder, Eileen refined her technique with the dedication of a craftsman perfecting his art. She studied traffic patterns, identified the most isolated stretches of highway, and learned to read potential victims with the calculating precision of a predator who had evolved specifically for this purpose. Her target demographic became clear: middle-aged white males traveling alone, usually businessmen or workers who frequented prostitutes and wouldn't be immediately missed by family or colleagues. These men were perfect victims. Their shame about seeking paid sexual encounters would delay reporting. Their isolation made them vulnerable, and their predictable behavior patterns made them easy to hunt. The psychological foundation for her killing spree had been laid decades earlier in that Michigan basement, where a little girl had sworn she would never be powerless again. Now, with a gun in her hand and endless highways stretching before her, Eileen Wuornos was finally keeping that promise. Every trigger pull was a declaration of war against a gender that had brutalized her since childhood. Every mutilated corpse was a monument to her refusal to remain a victim. The monster was fully awakened now, and her hunger for blood would only grow stronger with each successful kill. Florida's highways had become her personal slaughterhouse, and she was just getting started on what would become one of the most brutal killing sprees in American criminal history. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement had never encountered anything like the carnage that began appearing along the state's highways in 1990. Bodies discovered in various stages of decomposition, each bearing the unmistakable signature of extreme violence, each telling the same terrifying story. A predator was stalking Florida's roads with the methodical precision of a hunting machine. What made these crimes particularly chilling wasn't just their brutality, it was their calculated nature. This wasn't the work of a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was systematic execution, carried out by someone who derived genuine pleasure from inflicting maximum suffering before delivering death as a final act of mercy. May 19, 1990, construction worker David Spears, 43 years old and recently separated from his wife, was driving his pickup truck along State Road 40 near Astor, Florida, when he spotted a familiar sight. A woman stranded on the roadside, thumb extended in the universal gesture of desperation. Spears had always prided himself on being a good Samaritan, the kind of man who would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. His kindness would cost him everything. Eileen had been hunting for 3 days without success, growing increasingly agitated as potential victims either ignored her completely or seemed too suspicious to approach. The rage was building inside her like pressure in a volcano, demanding release through violence and bloodshed. When Spears pulled over, She knew immediately that he would be perfect, trusting, isolated, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen to him. "Where you headed, honey?" Spears asked as she climbed into the passenger seat, his voice carrying the gentle accent of someone who had lived his entire life in rural Florida. He was wearing work clothes stained with concrete dust, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel with the confidence of a man who had never known real danger. "Just up the road a piece," Aileen replied, her voice taking on the sultry tone she had perfected over years of street prostitution. "But maybe we could pull over somewhere private first? I could show you a real good time for $50. Spears considered the proposition for exactly the length of time it took his blood to rush from his brain to his groin. He had been lonely since his separation, working long hours just to avoid going home to an empty trailer, and the prospect of female companionship, even paid companionship, was too tempting to resist. "I know a place," he said, turning off the main highway onto a dirt logging road that disappeared into the cypress swamps. The truck bounced along the rutted path, deeper into wilderness where screams would be swallowed by the humid air and Spanish moss. Aileen smiled as they drove deeper into her trap. This was always the moment she savored most, when the victim finally realized they were no longer in control, when the predator-prey relationship revealed itself in all its savage clarity. She could smell Spears' anticipation, could see the way his hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as he contemplated the encounter ahead. When they reached a small clearing surrounded by towering cypress trees, their branches draped with moss like funeral shrouds, Spears parked the truck and turned toward her with an expectant smile. He was reaching for his wallet when Aileen drew her pistol, the metal gleaming in the filtered sunlight like a promise of death. "What the hell?" Spears began, but his words were cut off by the first shot, a .22 caliber bullet that tore through his shoulder and sent him sprawling against the driver's side door. The confined space of the truck cab amplified the gunshot to ear-splitting levels, and Aileen felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with absolute power over another human being. But unlike her first kill, this time she wanted to savor the experience. Instead of finishing him quickly, she climbed out of the truck and walked around to the driver's side, where Spears was frantically trying to apply pressure to his wounded shoulder while fumbling for the keys with his uninjured hand. "Please," he gasped, blood seeping between his fingers as he stared up at her with eyes wide with terror and confusion. "Please, I got kids. I got a family. Whatever you want, just take it." His pleading only intensified her rage. How many times had she begged for mercy as a child? How many times had her cries fallen on deaf ears while men inflicted their will upon her broken body? The irony was perfect. Now she was the one with the power, and this pathetic creature was learning what helplessness truly meant. The second shot shattered his left kneecap, sending fragments of bone and cartilage throughout the truck cab. Spears screamed with a sound that was barely human, his body convulsing as shock began to set in. But Aileen wasn't finished with her lesson in powerlessness. She opened the driver's side door and dragged him out by his injured arm, ignoring his screams of agony as his shoulder wound tore wider. Once he was on the ground, bleeding into the sandy soil of the forest floor, she began the real torture. Using her boots, she systematically broke his fingers one by one, each crack of splintering bone accompanied by fresh screams that echoed through the cypress swamp. She wanted him to understand that his body no longer belonged to him, that he was now nothing more than an object for her entertainment. The psychological torture was even more devastating than the physical abuse. She told him in graphic detail about her first kill, describing how she had mutilated Richard Mallory while he was still alive, how she had carved her initials into his forehead as he gurgled his final breaths. She wanted Spears to know that his death wouldn't be quick or merciful, that he would suffer for as long as she found it amusing. When she finally grew bored with his screams, she ended his misery with a single shot to the base of his skull, the bullet destroying his brainstem and silencing his pleas forever. The sudden quiet that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle lapping of swamp water against cypress roots and the buzz of insects already attracted by the smell of fresh blood. But death was never enough for Aileen. She needed to mark her territory, to leave a signature that would haunt investigators and strike fear into anyone who discovered her work. Using the hunting knife she had carried specifically for this purpose, she began her ritual mutilation of the corpse. Deep gashes across the chest formed a crude W for Wernos, while puncture wounds in the abdomen were arranged in patterns that suggested some sort of deranged artistry. She saved the most disturbing mutilation for last, carving away portions of his face until he was unrecognizable as the kind construction worker who had simply wanted to help a stranded motorist. The truck was abandoned miles away after being thoroughly cleaned of fingerprints and trace evidence. Aileen had learned from her first kill, developing a methodology that would make her crimes increasingly difficult to solve. She was evolving as a predator, adapting her techniques with each successful hunt. David Spear's body was discovered 6 days later by fishermen whose boat had run aground in the shallow water near the crime scene. Their screams could be heard across the entire swamp as they stumbled backward from what remained of a human being, their minds unable to process the level of savagery that had been inflicted upon another person. The killing was becoming addictive. Each successful hunt fed a hunger that could never be truly satisfied, only temporarily appeased before growing stronger than before. Aileen found herself cruising the highways constantly now, studying traffic patterns and potential victims with the focused intensity of a scientist conducting research. June 1990. Charles Carskadden, a 40-year-old part-time rodeo worker, was driving his 1975 Cadillac along State Road 19 when he spotted a woman walking along the shoulder, her thumb extended toward oncoming traffic. Something about her seemed familiar. Perhaps he had seen her before at one of the truck stops where he occasionally picked up prostitutes during his travels between rodeo venues. The recognition would prove fatal. Carskadden pulled over with the casual confidence of a man who had engaged in these transactions dozens of times before. To him, this was simply business. A brief exchange of money for services that would help pass the time during his long drives across Florida's endless highways. "Need a ride, sweetheart?" he called out as she approached his window, his voice carrying the cockiness of someone who believed himself to be in complete control of the situation. "Depends on where you're going," Aileen replied, already calculating the best location for what she had planned, "and whether you're looking for some company along the way." The negotiation was brief and professional. $50 for full service at a location of her choosing, payment in advance, no questions asked. Carskadden agreed immediately, his excitement already building as he contemplated the encounter ahead. As they drove deeper into Pasco County, following back roads that wound through cattle ranches and orange groves, Aileen studied her victim with the analytical precision of a pathologist preparing for an autopsy. Carskadden was smaller than her previous victims, probably weighing no more than 160 pounds, which would make the physical aspects of the killing easier to manage. "Turn here," she directed when they reached a dirt road that disappeared into a grove of abandoned citrus trees, their branches heavy with rotting fruit that filled the air with the sickly sweet smell of decay. It was perfect, isolated, rarely traveled, and surrounded by vegetation that would conceal any evidence of what was about to occur. When Carskadden parked the Cadillac in a small clearing surrounded by dying orange trees, he turned toward her with the same expectant smile that had sealed his fate. But this time, Aileen decided to experiment with a different approach to the killing. Instead of immediately drawing her weapon, she began to remove her clothes slowly, watching as Carskadden's eyes glazed over with lust and anticipation. She wanted him completely distracted, totally focused on what he believed was about to happen, before she revealed the true nature of their encounter. "You're real pretty," Carskadden murmured as she stripped down to her underwear, his hands already reaching for his belt buckle. "I bet you know how to show a man a good time." "Oh, I do," Aileen whispered, leaning close enough that her breath tickled his ear. "I know exactly how to show you something you'll never forget." The pistol appeared in her hand like a magic trick, the barrel pressed against Carskadden's temple before he could even register what was happening. His expression shifted from lust to confusion to pure terror in the space of a heartbeat, his brain struggling to process the sudden reversal of power. "Wait, what are you?" he began, but the first shot cut off his words forever. The bullet entered his skull just above his right ear, but Aileen had deliberately aimed to avoid immediately fatal areas. She wanted him conscious for what came next. Carskadden slumped forward, blood streaming from the head wound as his body went into shock. But he was still alive, still aware of what was happening to him, which was exactly what Aileen had intended. She dragged him from the car and into the grove of rotting citrus trees, where the smell of decomposing fruit would help mask the odor of his decaying corpse. Once she had him positioned exactly where she wanted, she began the most elaborate torture session of her killing career to date. Using her knife, she made shallow cuts across his chest and arms, not deep enough to cause rapid blood loss, but sufficient to inflict excruciating pain. Each slice was calculated to maximize suffering while prolonging consciousness, turning his body into a canvas for her artistic expression of rage. She told him about her childhood as she worked, describing in vivid detail the abuse she had suffered at the hands of men just like him. Every cut of the blade was punctuated by stories of rape, beatings, and psychological torture that had shaped her into the monster she had become. "You want to know why this is happening?" she hissed as she carved another deep gash across his abdomen. "Because men like you think women are just objects for your pleasure. Because you believe you can use us and throw us away like garbage." Carskadden tried to speak, tried to plead for mercy, but his punctured lung made it impossible to form coherent words. Only gasps and gurgles emerged from his mouth as blood filled his respiratory system, slowly drowning him from the inside. The final kill shot came nearly an hour later, when Aileen finally grew tired of his suffering. She placed the pistol against his forehead and pulled the trigger, ending his agony with the same casual indifference she might show when swatting a mosquito. But the mutilation continued long after death had claimed him. She carved her initials into various parts of his body, arranged his limbs in deliberately grotesque positions, and finally, in a burst of inspiration, used his blood to paint crude symbols on the nearby trees, marking the grove as her territory like some primitive predator claiming its hunting ground. Charles Carskadden's remains were discovered 2 weeks later by migrant workers harvesting fruit in an adjacent grove. The decomposition was so advanced that identification required dental records, but the signature mutilations left no doubt about who was responsible for his death. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement was beginning to recognize a pattern, and task forces were being assembled to hunt for what the media had begun calling the highway killer. But Aileen was always one step ahead, constantly adapting her methods and changing her hunting grounds to avoid capture. The success of her first 3 murders had given Aileen a confidence that bordered on invincibility. She began to take greater risks, staying longer with her victims to perfect her torture techniques, leaving more elaborate crime scenes that showcased her evolving artistry of death. The psychological satisfaction she derived from these killings was beyond anything she had ever experienced. Each successful hunt validated her twisted worldview, proving that she was no longer the helpless victim she had been as a child. She was the predator now, the one who controlled life and death with the squeeze of a trigger. But with each kill, her hunger grew stronger. The intervals between murders grew shorter, and her methods became increasingly savage as she pushed the boundaries of human endurance and suffering. She was no longer simply killing for revenge. She was killing because she had discovered her true nature, and that nature was pure evil. June 7, 1990. Peter Seams, a 65-year-old retired merchant marine, was driving his 1988 Pontiac Sunbird from Arkansas to Florida to visit family when he made the fatal decision to pick up a hitchhiker. Seams was a religious man, someone who genuinely believed in helping his fellow human beings, and his compassion would ultimately cost him his life. Aileen had been hunting along Interstate 75 for 2 days without success when she spotted Seams' Pontiac approaching her position near Wildwood, Florida. Something about the car suggested an out-of-state driver. The way it moved cautiously through traffic, the slight hesitation at highway exchanges, and out-of-state victims were always preferable because their disappearance would take longer to investigate. When Seams pulled over to offer assistance, Aileen immediately recognized him as the perfect victim. He was elderly, traveling alone, and clearly possessed the kind of trusting nature that made him vulnerable to her predatory tactics. His Arkansas license plates meant that days or even weeks might pass before anyone reported him missing. "Car trouble, miss?" Seems asked through his rolled-down window, his voice carrying the gentle accent of the rural South and the kind of genuine concern that was becoming increasingly rare in modern society. "Oh yes, sir," Aileen replied, affecting the helpless femininity that had proven so effective in previous hunts. "My car broke down about 5 miles back, and I've been walking for hours. I just need to get to a phone so I can call for help." Seems didn't hesitate. His Christian upbringing had taught him that helping strangers in distress was not just a moral obligation but a divine commandment, and he would no more leave a woman stranded on the highway than he would ignore a drowning victim in a lake. "Well, climb on in," he said, unlocking the passenger door with the trusting smile of someone who had never encountered true evil in his 65 years of life. "There's a truck stop about 10 miles up the road where you can use the phone." As they drove north on I-75, Seams made polite conversation about the weather, his family in Florida, and his planned retirement activities. He was genuinely interested in Eileen's story, expressing sympathy when she told him fabricated tales of mechanical problems and financial hardship. His kindness only intensified her rage. Here was another man who thought he could control the situation, who believed his false compassion gave him power over her. The fact that his concern seemed genuine made it even more infuriating. She had learned never to trust male kindness, because it always came with a price. "Actually," she said when they had traveled about 15 miles, "I just remembered my friend has a place just up this exit. Could you drop me there instead? I hate to impose on your generosity." Seams agreed immediately, following her directions off the interstate and onto a series of increasingly isolated back roads that wound through the green swamp area north of Tampa. As they drove deeper into wilderness, passing fewer and fewer houses, his subconscious finally began to register warning signals that his conscious mind had ignored. "You sure this is the right way?" he asked as they turned onto a dirt road that disappeared into dense palmetto scrub. "Seems pretty remote out here." "Oh yes," Aileen assured him, her hand already moving toward her purse. "My friend likes his privacy. Just a little bit further." When they reached a small clearing surrounded by saw palmetto and pine trees, Aileen instructed Seams to stop the car. The isolation was perfect. They were miles from the nearest house, surrounded by wilderness that would swallow screams without an echo. "I don't see any house," Seams said, a note of concern finally creeping into his voice as he surveyed the empty clearing. His survival instincts, dormant for 65 years of peaceful living, were finally beginning to stir. "That's because we're not here to see a house," Aileen replied, drawing her .22 caliber pistol with the fluid motion of a practiced killer. "We're here so you can die." The transformation in her voice was chilling. Gone was the helpless woman in distress, replaced by something cold and predatory that made Seams' blood freeze in his veins. He stared at the gun with the incomprehension of someone whose worldview was being shattered in real time. "Please," he whispered, his hands trembling as he raised them in the universal gesture of surrender. "I was just trying to help you. I'm a Christian man. I have grandchildren." His pleas for mercy triggered something savage in Eileen's psyche. Every mention of his goodness, his family, his faith, it was all just another form of male manipulation in her twisted mind. Men had been using religion and righteousness to justify their cruelty toward women for centuries, and now this pathetic old man was trying the same tired tactics. The first shot took him in the chest, but Aileen had deliberately aimed to avoid the heart and major arteries. She wanted him conscious for what came next, wanted him to experience the full measure of helplessness that she had lived with for decades. Seams collapsed across the front seats, blood spreading across his white shirt like crimson flowers blooming in snow. But his eyes remained open, filled with pain and confusion as he struggled to understand why his act of kindness had been rewarded with violence. "You want to know why this is happening?" Aileen hissed as she climbed out of the car and walked around to the driver's side. "Because your entire gender is a disease on this planet. Because men like you pretend to be good while you rape and abuse and destroy everything you touch." She dragged him from the car with surprising strength, his body leaving a trail of blood across the sandy ground. Once she had him positioned in the clearing, she began the ritual that had become her signature. the systematic destruction of his body as a monument to her rage against all masculinity. Using her hunting knife, she carved deep gashes across his chest, each cut deeper and more savage than the last. But unlike her previous victims, she took her time with seams, drawing out his suffering for over 2 hours as she vented decades of accumulated hatred onto his helpless form. She told him about her childhood as she worked, describing every beating, every rape, every moment of degradation she had endured at the hands of men who claimed to be protecting her. Each slice of the blade was punctuated by stories of abuse that made even her previous crimes seem merciful by comparison. "My grandfather used to tell me I was worthless," she whispered as she carved another gash across his abdomen. "He said I would never amount to anything but a whore and a criminal. Well, look at me now, old man. I'm both of those things, but I'm also something he never expected. I'm the one with the power now." When Seams finally died, it was almost a relief for both of them. His suffering ended with a final shot to the head, but Eileen's work was far from finished. She spent another hour mutilating the corpse, arranging it in a position that would maximize the psychological impact on whoever discovered it. The Pontiac Sunbird became crucial evidence when it was discovered abandoned in a different county, but by then Aileen had vanished back into the network of highways and truck stops that had become her hunting ground. Peter Seam's body was never found. It remains somewhere in the green swamp, his bones picked clean by scavengers, another victim claimed by Florida's most vicious predator. July 30th, 1990. The killing spree was accelerating now, with barely a month between murders as Eileen's hunger for blood grew increasingly insatiable. Troy Burress, a 50-year-old sausage salesman from Ocala, was driving his delivery truck along State Road 19 when he spotted a woman walking along the shoulder in the brutal Florida heat. Burress was a family man, someone who genuinely cared about his community and felt a responsibility to help those in need. His compassion would prove fatal. "Need a lift?" he called out as he pulled his truck to the shoulder, the engine idling as heat waves shimmered off the asphalt like liquid fire. "It's too hot out here for walking." Aileen approached the passenger side with the practiced desperation of a woman in distress, but internally she was calculating the best approach for this particular victim. Burress was larger than her previous targets, probably weighing close to 200 pounds, which would require a different strategy. "Oh, thank you so much," she gasped, affecting the breathless exhaustion of someone who had been walking for hours. "My car broke down about 5 miles back, and I thought I was going to die in this heat." As they drove along the highway, Burress made friendly conversation about the weather, his sales route, and his concern for her welfare. He was genuinely worried about her, repeatedly asking if she needed medical attention or wanted him to call someone on her behalf. His kindness was like acid poured directly onto her psyche. She had learned never to trust male compassion, because it always came with hidden expectations and ulterior motives. Better to strike first, to maintain control of the situation before he could reveal his true intentions. "Actually," she said after they had driven for about 10 miles, "I just remembered my cousin has a place just off this next exit. Could you drop me there? I hate to keep imposing on your kindness." Burress agreed immediately, following her directions onto increasingly isolated back roads that wound through cattle ranches and orange groves. As they drove deeper into rural Polk County, he began to express concern about the remote location. "You sure this is right?" he asked as they turned onto a dirt road that disappeared into palmetto scrub. "Seems pretty far from civilization." "Just a little further," Aileen assured him, her hand already moving toward her weapon. "My cousin likes his privacy." When they reached a small clearing surrounded by saw palmetto and pine trees, she instructed him to stop the truck. The isolation was perfect, miles from any witnesses, surrounded by wilderness that would conceal the crime scene for weeks or months. "I don't see any house," Burress said, his voice finally carrying a note of suspicion as he surveyed the empty clearing. "That's because there is no house," Aileen replied, drawing her pistol with the fluid motion that had become second nature. "This is where you die." The first shot caught Burress in the shoulder, but instead of collapsing like her previous victims, he lunged across the truck cab in a desperate attempt to wrestle the gun away from her. His size and strength gave him a temporary advantage, and for a terrifying moment Aileen thought she might lose control of the situation. But her experience with violence far exceeded his, and she managed to fire 2 more shots at point-blank range, both bullets tearing through his torso and sending him crashing back against the driver's side door. Blood splattered across the truck's interior like abstract art painted in crimson. "Please," Burris gasped as he clutched his wounds, his white shirt rapidly turning red as blood seeped between his fingers. "I got kids. I got a wife. Please don't do this." His pleas only intensified her rage. How many times had she begged for mercy as a child? How many times had men ignored her cries while they brutalized her broken body? The irony was perfect. Now she was the one with absolute power, and this pathetic creature was learning what true helplessness felt like. She dragged him from the truck and into the palmetto scrub, ignoring his screams of agony as his wounds tore wider. Once she had him positioned where she wanted, she began the most elaborate torture session of her career to date. Using her knife, she made dozens of shallow cuts across his body, each one calculated to inflict maximum pain while avoiding vital organs. She wanted him conscious for as long as possible, wanted him to experience every moment of his destruction. "You want to know why this is happening?" she hissed as she carved another gash across his chest. "Because men like you pretend to be good while you use and abuse women. Because you think your fake kindness gives you the right to control us." Burris tried to speak, tried to explain that he had genuinely wanted to help her, but his punctured lung made coherent speech impossible. Only gasps and gurgles emerged as blood filled his respiratory system. The torture continued for over 3 hours, with Aileen taking breaks to rest and hydrate while Burris slowly bled out in the Florida heat. She told him about each of her previous victims, describing their deaths in graphic detail, making sure he understood that his suffering was just one movement in a larger symphony of revenge. When she finally grew bored with his agony, she ended it with a shot to the base of his skull. The sudden silence that followed was profound, broken only by the buzz of insects already attracted to the smell of fresh blood. Troy Burris' body was discovered a week later by hunters whose dogs had been drawn to the decomposing remains. The level of mutilation was so extreme that identification required dental records and DNA analysis. September 11, 1990. The date would become seared into the memory of every law enforcement officer working the case, because this kill would provide the first major breakthrough in their investigation. Charles Humphreys, a 56-year-old retired Air Force major and former police chief, was driving his 1987 Oldsmobile along State Road 19 when he made the fatal decision to offer assistance to a stranded motorist. Humphreys represented everything Aileen had learned to hate about authority figures. A former cop, a military man, someone who had spent his entire career wielding power over others. His death would be the most satisfying yet, a symbolic victory over every uniform that had ever terrorized her. "Car trouble?" Humphreys called out as he pulled over, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to taking charge of situations. Even in retirement, he maintained the bearing of a law enforcement officer. "Oh yes, sir," Aileen replied, recognizing immediately that this victim would require a different approach. His military background meant he would be more suspicious, more alert to danger, but it also meant he would feel obligated to help what appeared to be a woman in distress. As they drove toward what she claimed was her broken-down vehicle, Aileen studied Humphreys with the analytical precision of a predator sizing up particularly dangerous prey. He was alert, constantly scanning their surroundings, his hands positioned on the steering wheel in a way that would allow him to react quickly to any threat. But his training had prepared him for conventional dangers, armed robbers, drunk drivers, domestic disputes. Nothing in his experience had equipped him to recognize the monster sitting in his passenger seat, the predator who had already claimed 5 lives and was hungry for a 6th. When they reached the isolated location she had selected, Humphreys immediately sensed something was wrong. His cop instincts were screaming danger, but his conscious mind was still processing what his subconscious had already recognized. "I don't see any broken-down car," he said, his hand moving instinctively toward the glove compartment where he kept his service revolver. But Aileen was faster. Her .22 caliber pistol appeared in her hand like magic, the barrel aimed directly at his head before he could complete his reach for his own weapon. "That's because there is no car," she said, her voice dropping to the cold, emotionless tone that her victims heard in their final moments. "But there is going to be another dead cop, and that makes me very happy." The recognition in Humphrey's eyes was immediate and terrible. He had spent decades hunting criminals, and now he was staring into the face of pure evil, recognizing that he had become prey for something far more dangerous than any criminal he had ever encountered. "You're the highway killer," he whispered, his training finally providing context for the situation he found himself in. "You're the one who's been murdering all those men. Guilty as charged," Aileen replied with a smile that belonged in nightmares. "And you're about to become victim number 6. I hope that badge was worth dying for." The first shot shattered Humphrey's right shoulder, but his police training kicked in immediately. Despite the pain, he threw himself across the car in a desperate attempt to wrestle the gun away from her, his size and combat experience giving him a temporary advantage. But Aileen had been killing for months now, and her reflexes had been honed by successful violence. She managed to fire 3 more shots at point-blank range, each bullet finding its mark in his torso and sending him crashing back against the driver's seat. "Not so tough now, are you, pig?" she hissed as Humphreys clutched his wounds, his police uniform rapidly soaking through with blood. "Where's your authority now? Where's your badge going to save you?" His death would be the most elaborate yet, a masterpiece of torture that reflected all her accumulated hatred toward law enforcement. She dragged him from the car and spent over 4 hours systematically destroying his body, each cut of her knife accompanied by stories of every brutal encounter she had ever had with police. When Charles Humphrey's mutilated corpse was finally discovered, it would provide investigators with their first major breakthrough. His police background meant the crime scene would be processed with extraordinary care, and trace evidence would finally point them toward their suspect. But that was still weeks away. For now, Aileen was riding high on the satisfaction of having killed a cop, having struck a blow against the system that had tormented her since childhood. She was 6 victims into her killing spree, and her hunger for blood was stronger than ever. November 19th, 1990. The final kill would be the most brutal yet, a crescendo of violence that would cap off one of the most savage killing sprees in American criminal history. Walter Antonio, a 60-year-old security guard, was driving home from his night shift when he spotted a woman walking along Highway 19, her thumb extended toward oncoming traffic. Antonio was a grandfather, someone who had spent his entire life working honest jobs and trying to make his community a better place. His compassion for others would cost him everything. "Need a ride, miss?" he called out as he pulled over, his voice carrying the gentle concern of someone who genuinely cared about the welfare of strangers. As Antonio drove toward what he believed was her destination, Aileen was already savoring the anticipation of her final kill. 7 victims would be the perfect number, enough to cement her legacy as America's most feared female serial killer, but not so many that the investigation would overwhelm her ability to evade capture. When they reached the isolated location she had selected deep in the Ocala National Forest, Antonio began to sense that something was terribly wrong. The road had deteriorated to little more than a dirt track, and there were no signs of human habitation anywhere in the surrounding wilderness. "I don't think this is right," he said, his voice carrying the first notes of concern as he surveyed the empty forest around them. "Maybe we should turn back. We're exactly where we need to be," Aileen replied, drawing her weapon with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this ritual 6 times before. "This is where you die, old man." The terror in Antonio's eyes was immediate and complete as he stared down the barrel of her pistol, his mind struggling to comprehend how a simple act of kindness had led to this nightmare scenario. "Please," he whispered, his hands trembling as he raised them in surrender. "I'm just a security guard. I was trying to help you." His pleas fell on deaf ears. Aileen had moved beyond any capacity for mercy or compassion. She was a killing machine now, a predator who existed solely to inflict death and suffering on anyone unfortunate enough to cross her path. The first shot took Antonio in the chest, but Aileen had deliberately aimed to avoid immediately fatal areas. She wanted this final kill to be special, wanted to savor every moment of his destruction as the culmination of her reign of terror. What followed was the most elaborate torture session of her entire killing career. For over 5 hours, she systematically destroyed Walter Antonio's body while telling him about each of her previous victims, describing their deaths in graphic detail, making sure he understood that his suffering was just the final movement in a symphony of revenge that had been building for months. When Antonio finally died, it was almost merciful compared to what he had endured. But even death couldn't save him from Eileen's rage. She continued mutilating his corpse for another hour, creating a crime scene so horrific that even seasoned investigators would require psychological counseling after processing it. Walter Antonio's body was discovered 3 days later by hunters whose dogs had been attracted by the smell of decomposition. The level of savagery was unprecedented, even by Eileen's standards. This was the work of someone who had moved completely beyond the boundaries of human behavior into something approaching pure evil. 7 men were now dead, their bodies scattered across Florida's highways like monuments to one woman's rage against an entire gender. The reign of terror was complete, but Aileen Wuornos didn't know that her killing spree was about to come to an abrupt and violent end. The monster had gorged herself on blood and suffering, but now it was time for the hunters to become the hunted. Law enforcement was closing in, and America's deadliest woman was about to discover that even the most vicious predator could become prey. By December 1990, the Florida highways had become rivers of blood, stained with the carnage of 7 brutal murders that had terrorized an entire state. The media had dubbed the perpetrator the Highway Huntress, and her name was whispered in truck stops and rest areas from Pensacola to Key West. But Aileen Wuornos had no idea that her reign of terror was about to come to a catastrophic end, that the very law enforcement system she had spent months taunting was finally closing in for the kill. The investigation had reached a fever pitch. Task forces from multiple agencies were working around the clock, processing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and slowly building a profile of the most dangerous female predator in American criminal history. The breakthrough had come from Charles Humphrey's murder. His law enforcement background had ensured that his crime scene was processed with extraordinary care, and trace evidence had finally provided investigators with their first solid leads. Detective John Munster of the Volusia County Sheriff's Department had been living and breathing this case for months, surviving on caffeine and determination as he pursued a killer who seemed to vanish into thin air after each murder. The crime scenes were escalating in brutality, and Munster knew that if they didn't catch her soon, the body count would continue to climb. "She's getting sloppy," Munster told his partner as they reviewed the latest evidence reports. The Humphrey scene gave us tire tracks, footprints, and what looks like a partial fingerprint on the victim's wallet. She's been killing so frequently that she's making mistakes. But Aileen wasn't making mistakes. She was evolving. Each kill had taught her something new about the art of murder, and by her 7th victim, she had developed a methodology that was both efficient and terrifyingly brutal. What the investigators were seeing wasn't sloppiness. It was confidence bordering on arrogance. She believed herself to be untouchable, invincible, a predator so perfectly adapted to her environment that capture was impossible. That arrogance would prove to be her downfall. December 1990. The investigation took a dramatic turn when witnesses at a truck stop near Daytona Beach reported seeing a woman matching Eileen's description arguing violently with another woman near a payphone. The witness accounts were detailed enough to provide investigators with their first comprehensive physical description of their suspect, and the argument suggested that she wasn't working alone. The second woman was identified as Tyria Moore, a 28-year-old hotel maid who had been living with Aileen in a series of cheap motels along the Florida coast. Tyria had been Eileen's lover for over 2 years, the closest thing to a stable relationship that the killer had ever experienced. But she was also the only person who knew the truth about Eileen's nocturnal activities, the only witness to America's most brutal killing spree. Investigators had found their pressure point. On January 9, 1991, Tyria Moore was located at her sister's house in Pittston, Pennsylvania, where she had fled after becoming increasingly terrified of Eileen's escalating violence. The woman who answered the door was hollow-eyed and trembling, someone who had been living with the knowledge that her lover was a serial killer and the constant fear that she might be the next victim. "I know why you're here," Tyria whispered as she opened the door to find Detective Munster and a team of investigators on her doorstep. "You're here about Aileen, about what she's been doing." The interrogation that followed would provide law enforcement with the breakthrough they had been desperately seeking. Tyria Moore knew everything: the locations where Aileen hunted, her methods of selecting victims, even details about some of the crime scenes that had never been released to the public. She would come home covered in blood, Tyria sobbed as she recounted months of living in terror. She would tell me about the men she had killed, describing what she did to them in detail. She seemed to enjoy it, like it was some kind of game to her. But Tyria's most valuable contribution to the investigation was her willingness to cooperate in Eileen's capture. She agreed to make recorded phone calls to her former lover, calls that would be monitored by law enforcement and used to gather evidence about the murders. The psychological manipulation was masterful. Investigators coached Tyria on exactly what to say, how to push Eileen's emotional buttons, how to make her believe that their relationship could be salvaged if she would just confess to the murders and accept responsibility for her crimes. January 14, 1991. The first recorded phone call between Tyria Moore and Aileen Wuornos would provide investigators with crucial evidence about the killer's state of mind and her methods of operation. Aileen was staying at the Fairview Motel in Port Orange, Florida, completely unaware that law enforcement was closing in around her like a tightening noose. "Lee, it's me," Tyria said when Aileen answered the phone, her voice carefully modulated to convey just the right mixture of love and desperation. "I miss you so much. I can't stand being away from you." Eileen's response was immediate and emotional. She had been spiraling into paranoia and depression since Tyria's disappearance, convinced that her lover had abandoned her just like everyone else in her miserable life. The sound of Tyria's voice was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "Ty, where are you?" Aileen sobbed into the phone, her usual hardness cracking to reveal the desperate loneliness underneath. "I've been looking for you everywhere. I thought you were dead, or that you'd left me for someone else." "I had to leave, Lee," Tyria replied, following the script that investigators had prepared for her. "The police are everywhere, asking questions about those murders. I was scared they were going to arrest me too." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Tyria skillfully drawing Aileen out about the murders while investigators recorded every word. Aileen didn't confess outright, but she made several statements that could be interpreted as admissions of guilt, and her emotional responses provided valuable insights into her psychological state. "I did what I had to do," Aileen said at one point, her voice dropping to the cold tone that her victims had heard in their final moments. "Those men got what they deserved. They were all rapists and perverts who would have hurt other women if I hadn't stopped them." The calls continued over several days, each conversation providing more evidence while investigators prepared for the final phase of their operation. They had located their suspect, they had evidence linking her to multiple murders, and most importantly, they had a cooperative witness who could testify about Eileen's confessions. It was time for the hunt to end. January 16, 1991, 10:14 a.m. The Fairview Motel in Port Orange, Florida, would become the final chapter in Aileen Wuornos' reign of terror. She was sitting at the bar in the motel's dingy lounge, nursing a beer and chain-smoking cigarettes, when Detective Munster and his team moved in for the arrest. Aileen saw them coming before they reached her table. Years of living on the streets had given her an almost supernatural ability to detect law enforcement. But instead of running, she simply took another drag from her cigarette and smiled with the cold satisfaction of someone who had always known this moment would come. "Aileen Wuornos," Detective Munster announced as he approached her table, his hand resting on the butt of his service weapon. "You're under arrest for the murder of Richard Mallory." "Took you long enough?" Aileen replied, stubbing out her cigarette with deliberate slowness. "I was starting to think you boys weren't smart enough to catch me." The arrest was surprisingly peaceful. Aileen offered no resistance as they handcuffed her and read her Miranda rights, maintaining the same cold demeanor that had characterized all her interactions with authority figures. But beneath the surface, investigators could sense something else. A mixture of relief and satisfaction, as if she was finally ready to claim credit for her masterpiece of murder. As they escorted her from the motel, past the gathering crowd of media and onlookers, Aileen walked with her head held high and a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She was no longer the scared little girl who had been brutalized in a Michigan basement. She was America's first female serial killer, a woman who had struck terror into the hearts of an entire state. "You want to know about the murders?" she asked as they placed her in the back of the patrol car. "I'll tell you about every single one of them, but don't expect me to apologize for what I did. Those bastards got exactly what they deserved." The Marion County Sheriff's Department had never seen anything like the media circus that erupted around Aileen Wuorno's arrest. News crews from across the country descended on Florida to cover the story of America's first female serial killer, and the interrogation room became the center of one of the most closely watched criminal cases in modern history. Detective Munster had prepared extensively for this moment, studying Aileen's psychological profile and developing an interrogation strategy designed to break through her defenses and extract detailed confessions about all 7 murders. But he quickly discovered that traditional interrogation techniques were useless against someone who felt no shame or remorse about what she had done. "Let's start with Richard Mallory," Munster said as he activated the recording equipment and settled in for what he knew would be a long session. "December 1st, 1989. Tell me what happened that night." Aileen's response was chilling in its matter-of-fact tone. She described Mallory's murder with the same emotional detachment that someone might use to discuss the weather, providing graphic details about the torture and mutilation while showing no signs of guilt or regret. "He thought he was going to rape me," she said, her eyes staring directly into the camera as if she was addressing the entire world. "He thought he could use me like a piece of meat and throw me away when he was finished. So I shot him, multiple times. Then I carved him up like the pig he was." The confession continued for over 8 hours, with Aileen providing detailed accounts of all 7 murders. She described her methods of selecting victims, her techniques for luring them to isolated locations, and the elaborate torture sessions that had become her signature. Most disturbingly, she seemed to take pride in the brutality of her crimes, smiling whenever she described a particularly savage detail. "David Spears begged for his life," she recounted with obvious satisfaction. "He told me about his children, about his family, about how sorry he was for whatever he thought he had done to deserve what was happening to him. But I didn't care. I wanted him to suffer the way I had suffered my entire life." Each confession was more horrifying than the last, painting a picture of systematic torture and murder that shocked even experienced investigators. But perhaps most disturbing was Aileen's complete lack of remorse. She genuinely believed that her victims had deserved their fate, that she was some sort of avenging angel cleaning up society's refuse. "I did the world a favor," she declared as the interrogation neared its end. "Every man I killed was a rapist, a pervert, someone who would have hurt other women if I hadn't stopped them. I'm not a serial killer. I'm a hero." The trial of Aileen Wuorno's began on January 14, 1992. Exactly 1 year after the phone calls that had led to her capture. The Volusia County Courthouse had been transformed into a fortress, surrounded by media trucks and protesters, with security measures that rivaled those of a presidential visit. Prosecutor Sean Daly had built his case methodically, presenting evidence that painted Aileen as a cold-blooded killer who had murdered 7 innocent men for money and psychological gratification. The forensic evidence was overwhelming, ballistics reports linking her weapon to multiple crime scenes, fingerprints found on victims' personal effects, and trace evidence that placed her at each murder location. But the defense team, led by attorney Stephen Glazer, had developed a strategy that would change the way America viewed female violence forever. They argued that Aileen was not a serial killer but a victim of lifelong abuse who had been forced to kill in self-defense, that each murder was the result of attempted rape or sexual assault by her victims. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Glazer said in his opening statement, "my client is not a monster. She is a survivor. She is a woman who was brutalized from childhood, who was forced onto the streets at an early age, who learned that violence was the only way to protect herself from men who viewed her as nothing more than an object for their sexual gratification." The self-defense strategy was unprecedented for a serial killer case, and it sparked a national debate about female violence, prostitution, and the treatment of abuse victims within the criminal justice system. Feminist groups rallied to Eileen's defense, arguing that she represented all women who had been victimized by male violence, while law enforcement officials insisted that her crimes were too brutal and systematic to be explained by self-defense. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented evidence showing that Aileen had lured her victims to isolated locations, that she had tortured them for hours before killing them, and that she had stolen their belongings and abandoned their bodies with calculated precision. Most damaging was her recorded confession, in which she described the murders with obvious satisfaction and showed no signs of acting in self-defense. This defendant didn't kill in self-defense, Prosecutor Daly told the jury during his closing argument. She killed for money, for pleasure, and for revenge against an entire gender. She is a predator who used her sexuality as bait to lure unsuspecting victims to their deaths. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. When the foreman read the verdict aloud, Aileen showed no emotion, staring straight ahead with the same cold expression that had characterized her entire trial. "Do you have anything to say before sentencing?" Judge Uriel Blunt asked as court reconvened for the penalty phase. Aileen rose slowly, her shackles clanking as she faced the jury that had just condemned her to death. For a moment, the mask slipped, and everyone in the courtroom could see the scared little girl who still lived somewhere deep inside the monster she had become. "I killed those men because they were going to rape me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I killed them in self-defense, and I'd do it again if I had to. You people don't understand what it's like to live in fear every day of your life, to know that any man you meet might be the one who destroys you." Then the mask snapped back into place, and the cold predator returned. "But I don't expect you to understand," she continued, her voice growing stronger and more defiant. "You've already made up your minds that I'm a monster, so go ahead and kill me. I'll be famous forever, and you'll all be forgotten." Judge Blunt sentenced her to death by electric chair, making her the second woman in Florida history to receive the death penalty. As the bailiffs led her away, Aileen turned back to face the packed courtroom one final time. "I'll see you all in hell," she called out, her voice carrying across the stunned silence like a curse. "And when I do, you better pray I don't have a gun." The Broward Correctional Institution became Aileen Wuorno's final home, a concrete cage where America's most notorious female serial killer would spend the last 11 years of her life awaiting execution. Death row was a special kind of hell, designed to break the spirits of even the most hardened criminals through isolation, routine, and the constant specter of impending death. But Aileen adapted to prison life with the same ruthless efficiency that had characterized her killing spree. She quickly established herself as the alpha predator in a facility filled with society's most dangerous women, using her reputation and capacity for violence to carve out a position of respect among inmates who would have intimidated lesser criminals. Her cell was a concrete box measuring 6 feet by 9 feet, furnished with a narrow cot, a metal toilet, and a small desk where she would spend hours writing letters to journalists, supporters, and anyone else who would listen to her increasingly paranoid rants about government conspiracies and male oppression. The media attention never ceased. Aileen became a celebrity of sorts, the subject of books, documentaries, and eventually a major motion picture that would immortalize her story for future generations. She courted this attention with the calculating precision of someone who understood that infamy was its own form of immortality. "I want people to remember me," she told a documentary filmmaker during one of her rare interviews. "I want them to know that Aileen Wuornos was here, that I fought back against a world that tried to destroy me from the day I was born." Her time on death row was marked by increasingly erratic behavior and deteriorating mental health. The isolation and stress of awaiting execution took their toll, and she began exhibiting signs of severe paranoia and psychosis. She claimed that prison guards were poisoning her food, that the government was conducting mind control experiments on her, and that she was being tortured with sonic weapons designed to drive her insane. But even in madness, traces of the calculating predator remained. She fired her attorneys and began representing herself, filing appeals and motions with the single-minded determination of someone who refused to go quietly into the night. Every legal brief was another chance to tell her story, another opportunity to justify the 7 murders that had made her infamous. As her execution date approached, Aileen granted a series of final interviews that would provide unprecedented insight into the mind of America's most notorious female serial killer. The woman who faced the cameras was a shadow of the predator who had terrorized Florida's highways. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, and consumed by paranoia that bordered on complete psychosis. "They want to make me look crazy," she told interviewer Nick Broomfield during their final meeting. "They want people to think I'm just some insane woman who snapped and started killing randomly. But that's not what happened. Every man I killed was trying to rape me. Every single one." Her insistence on the self-defense narrative never wavered, even as evidence continued to contradict her claims. Forensic analysis had shown that most of her victims were shot from behind or while attempting to flee, contradicting her assertions that they had been attacking her. But Aileen had constructed a reality in which she was the victim, and no amount of evidence could penetrate that delusion. "I killed 7 men who were going to hurt me," she repeated like a mantra. "I don't regret it, and I'd do it again if I had to. The only thing I regret is that I didn't kill more of them." The interviews revealed a woman who had been completely consumed by her own mythology, someone who had rewritten history to cast herself as an avenging angel rather than a predatory killer. She spoke of her victims with contempt, describing them as rapists and perverts who had deserved their fate, showing no recognition of the families they had left behind or the lives she had destroyed. "Richard Mallory was a convicted rapist," she claimed, referring to her first victim. "I found out after I killed him that he had raped other women. That proves I was right to kill him. God put me on those highways to clean up the trash that society couldn't deal with." Her religious delusions were particularly disturbing, representing a complete inversion of traditional moral values. In Aileen's twisted worldview, murder was a divine calling, torture was righteous justice, and her victims were demons who had deserved destruction at her hands. October 2002, just weeks before her scheduled execution, Aileen Wuornos made a final confession that would shock even those who had followed her case for over a decade. Speaking to investigators one last time, she abandoned her self-defense claims and admitted the truth about her killing spree. "I lied," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as the weight of over a decade of deception finally crushed her psychological defenses. "I lied about everything. Those men didn't try to rape me. I killed them because I wanted to. I killed them because I enjoyed it." The confession was devastating in its honesty, stripping away years of legal maneuvering and psychological manipulation to reveal the truth that investigators had suspected all along. Aileen Wuornos was not a victim who had been forced to kill in self-defense. She was a predator who had murdered 7 innocent men for money, psychological gratification, and revenge against an entire gender. "I robbed them and I killed them as cold as ice," she continued, her eyes staring directly into the camera as if she was addressing her victims' families personally. "And I'd do it again, too. There's no point in lying about it now. I'm going to be dead in a few weeks anyway." The confession provided closure for the families of her victims, validation for the law enforcement officers who had worked tirelessly to bring her to justice, and final proof that the justice system had reached the correct verdict in her case. But it also raised disturbing questions about the nature of evil and the capacity for human beings to inflict suffering on their fellow creatures. "I don't expect forgiveness," Aileen said as the interview neared its end. "I don't deserve it and I don't want it. I made my choices and now I'm going to pay for them. But I want people to know the truth. I killed those men because it felt good, because I wanted to, and because I could." October 9th, 2002, 9:47 a.m. Florida State Prison became the final stage for the last act of Aileen Wuornos' life. She had spent her final days on Earth writing letters, granting interviews, and making final preparations for an execution that she claimed to welcome as release from a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. The execution chamber was a sterile room painted in institutional green, dominated by an electric chair that had been nicknamed Old Sparky by the guards who maintained it. Aileen was escorted into the chamber by a team of corrections officers, her hands shackled behind her back, her face showing no emotion as she surveyed the room where she would die. "Any final words?" the warden asked as they strapped her into the chair, the leather restraints creaking as they were tightened around her wrists and ankles. Aileen lifted her head and stared directly at the observation window where witnesses to her execution were seated. Among them were family members of her victims, law enforcement officers who had worked her case, and journalists who had covered her story from the beginning. "I'd like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back," she said. Her final words a mixture of delusion and defiance that perfectly captured the twisted worldview that had driven her to murder. At exactly 9:47 a.m., 2,000 volts of electricity coursed through her body, ending the life of America's most notorious female serial killer. The execution was swift and efficient, a clinical end to a life that had been marked by violence, suffering, and unimaginable cruelty. But even in death, Aileen Wuornos continued to fascinate and terrify the American public. Her story had become legend, a cautionary tale about the capacity for human evil and the price of unchecked rage. She had achieved the immortality she had always craved, ensuring that her name would be spoken in the same breath as history's most infamous killers. The death of Aileen Wuornos marked the end of one of the most brutal killing sprees in American criminal history, but her legacy continued to haunt the highways where she had hunted and the communities where her victims had lived. The 7 families she had destroyed would never fully recover from their losses, and the law enforcement officers who had worked her case would carry the memory of those crime scenes for the rest of their lives. Her impact on popular culture was immediate and lasting. Books, documentaries, and movies would immortalize her story, transforming a cold-blooded killer into an anti-heroine for some and a cautionary tale for others. The 2003 film Monster, starring Charlize Theron in an Oscar-winning performance, would introduce Aileen's story to a new generation and spark fresh debates about the nature of justice and the treatment of abuse victims within the criminal justice system. But perhaps her most lasting legacy was the questions her case raised about the intersection of gender, violence, and victimization. Aileen Wuornos forced America to confront uncomfortable truths about female violence and the factors that could transform a victim into a predator. Her case became a lightning rod for discussions about domestic abuse, childhood trauma, and the failures of social systems designed to protect society's most vulnerable members. The highways of Florida eventually returned to normal, but they were forever changed by the knowledge of what had occurred there. Rest stops and truck stops that had once been mundane waypoints became pilgrimage sites for true crime enthusiasts, while law enforcement agencies incorporated lessons learned from the Wuornos case into their training protocols for serial killer investigations. 7 families lost husbands, fathers, and sons to Aileen's rage. Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Peter Seams, Troy Burress, Charles Humphreys, and Walter Antonio. Their names deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a criminal case, but as human beings whose lives were cut short by senseless violence. In the end, Aileen Wuornos got exactly what she wanted: immortality through infamy, a place in the pantheon of America's most notorious criminals, and the guarantee that her name would never be forgotten. But she also got justice, the kind of absolute, final justice that can only be delivered by the state in cases of ultimate evil. The monster was dead, but her legacy lived on, a reminder that evil can wear any face and that the capacity for violence exists in the most unexpected places. The highway huntress had claimed her final victim, herself, and taken her place in the darkest corners of American criminal history. Her reign of terror was over, but the memory of those 7 brutal murders would echo through the corridors of law enforcement agencies, the pages of criminal justice textbooks, and the nightmares of anyone who dared to venture onto the lonely highways where Aileen Wuornos had once hunted human prey with the cold efficiency of a perfect predator. The story was finished, written in blood across the asphalt arteries of Florida and sealed with the finality of judicial execution. America's first female serial killer was gone, but the horror she had unleashed would never be completely erased from the collective memory of a nation that had watched in fascination and terror as she transformed from victim to predator to legend. In death, as in life, Aileen Wuornos remained exactly what she had always been: a monster who had chosen evil over redemption, violence over healing, and revenge over forgiveness. Her story was a testament to the darkest possibilities of human nature and a warning about the price of allowing rage to consume reason. The highways were silent now, but they remembered. And in that remembrance, the 7 innocent men who had died screaming her name finally found their justice, and America found its peace. Story 2. Albert Fish, the Gray Man. A story of unimaginable evil. In the shadowy streets of 1920s New York, children began disappearing without a trace. Parents clutched their little ones closer, whispering warnings about strangers in the night. But they could never have imagined the monster that walked among them. A seemingly harmless old man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Albert Fish appeared to be nothing more than a frail grandfather, shuffling through the city with his paint-stained overalls and soft-spoken manner. But behind those deceiving eyes lurked the darkest depths of human depravity. Fish wasn't just a killer, he was a predator who turned childhood innocence into his personal hunting ground, transforming acts of unspeakable horror into his twisted form of pleasure. This is the story of America's most depraved serial killer, a man so evil that even hardened detectives couldn't sleep after hearing what he had done. They called him the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Moon Maniac. But to understand the true horror of Albert Fish, you must journey into the blackest corners of the human soul, where nightmares become reality and evil wears the mask of kindness. The year was 1870 when Hamilton Howard Fish drew his first breath in Washington, D.C. But even from his earliest moments, darkness seemed to follow him like a shadow. Born into a family already tainted by mental illness and perversion, young Albert, as he would later call himself, was destined for a path that would horrify the world. His father, Randall Fish, was a riverboat captain whose mind had been slowly consumed by madness. The elder Fish would spend hours staring into empty space, muttering incomprehensible words while his family watched in terror. When Albert was just 5 years old, his father's tortured mind finally surrendered to death, leaving behind a legacy of insanity that would poison his son's blood like a hereditary curse. But it was his mother, Ellen Fish, who would unknowingly nurture the monster growing within her child. Overwhelmed by poverty and unable to care for her children, she made a decision that would echo through decades of horror. She abandoned young Albert at St. John's Orphanage, a place where innocents went to die. The orphanage was a cathedral of suffering disguised as a house of God. Within its cold, stone walls, children learned that mercy was a fairy tale and that pain was the only constant companion they would ever know. The caretakers, twisted by their own demons, ruled through fear and brutality that would make grown men weep. It was here that Albert Fish first tasted the intoxicating mixture of pain and pleasure that would define his entire existence. The beatings came daily, leather straps that sang through the air before biting into young flesh, leaving welts that burned like brands of shame. But something horrifying began to happen within Albert's developing mind. Where other children learned to fear the strap, Albert began to crave it. The dormitory at night became a theater of whispered horrors. Older boys, already corrupted by the institution's cruelty, would prey upon the younger ones in ways that violated both body and soul. Albert wasn't just a victim, he was an eager student, absorbing every twisted lesson with the hunger of a starving man devouring a feast. By the age of 12, Albert had discovered that his body responded to pain in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. He would sneak away to hidden corners of the orphanage, driving rusty nails into his flesh just to feel the exquisite agony that followed. The pain became his drug, his religion, his reason for existence. When his mother finally reclaimed him at age 15, Albert Fish was no longer the innocent child she had abandoned. He had been transformed into something else entirely, a creature that wore the face of a boy but possessed the soul of a demon. The years at St. John's had planted seeds of evil so deep within his psyche that they would grow into a forest of horror that would consume innocent lives for decades to come. Back in his mother's home, Albert discovered new outlets for his twisted appetites. He began torturing neighborhood cats, taking perverse pleasure in their agonized screams. He would trap them in basements and abandoned buildings, subjecting them to experiments in pain that would have impressed the most sadistic medieval torturers. But animals weren't enough. The hunger growing within him demanded something more precious, something more forbidden. He began stalking the local children, studying their habits, learning their routines. He would follow them home from school, memorizing the layout of their houses, the times when they would be alone. His first taste of human flesh came from a chance encounter with a retarded boy in the neighborhood. The child, too simple to understand danger, trusted Albert's kind demeanor and gentle voice. What happened in that abandoned warehouse would remain Albert's secret for years, but it opened a door to appetites so depraved that they defied human comprehension. As Albert entered his 20s, he perfected the art of deception that would serve him throughout his killing career. He learned to project an image of harmless elderly gentility, the kind old man who helped lost children find their way home, who offered candy and kind words to lonely youngsters. His appearance was his greatest weapon. Thin and frail, with wispy gray hair and clothes that always seemed a size too large, he looked like everyone's harmless grandfather. He married and had children of his own, using his family as the perfect camouflage for his true nature. Who would suspect a devoted father and husband of harboring such monstrous appetites? His wife, Anna, noticed his strange behaviors, the way he would disappear for days without explanation, the disturbing sounds that came from the basement late at night, the smell of burnt flesh that sometimes clung to his clothes. But in those days, wives didn't question their husbands too closely, especially when those questions might lead to answers too horrible to bear. The basement of the fish home became his private laboratory of horror. He filled it with instruments of torture that he crafted with the dedication of an artisan. Razor-sharp knives, meat cleavers, bone saws, and contraptions designed to inflict maximum agony while keeping his victims conscious for as long as possible. The walls were stained with substances that spoke of unspeakable acts, and the floor was scorched from fires that had consumed evidence of his deepest depravities. It was in this hellish workshop that Albert Fish began to perfect the rituals that would define his killing spree. He discovered that fear made flesh taste sweeter, that prolonged terror added flavors that simple death could never provide. He learned to keep his victims alive for days, sometimes weeks, feeding them just enough to maintain their strength while he slowly carved away pieces of their innocence along with pieces of their bodies. His technique became an art form of evil. He would begin with small cuts, precise incisions that caused maximum pain while avoiding major arteries. He wanted his victims to understand what was happening to them, to fully appreciate the horror of their situation. He would whisper to them as he worked, describing in loving detail what he planned to do next, watching their eyes grow wide with the kind of terror that burns itself into the soul. The psychological torture was often worse than the physical mutilation. He would tell his young victims that their parents had sold them to him, that no one was looking for them, that they would spend eternity in his basement being slowly consumed piece by piece. He would show them photographs of his previous victims, describing their final moments with the enthusiasm of a chef discussing his favorite recipes. As the 1920s dawned, Albert Fish had evolved from a mere killer into something far more dangerous, a predator who had learned to hunt with scientific precision. His appearance had settled into the perfect disguise, a harmless old man who painted houses for a living, who seemed to fade into the background of everyday life like smoke dissipating in the wind. But beneath that carefully crafted exterior, the monster was growing hungrier with each passing day. The small kills, the occasional disappearance, were no longer enough to satisfy the bottomless pit of his appetites. He needed something bigger, something that would feed the beast within him for more than just a few weeks. That's when Albert Fish began planning what would become his most infamous crime, a kidnapping so brutal, so shocking in its depravity, that it would earn him a place among history's most notorious monsters. He had found his next victim, a little girl whose innocence would provide the perfect canvas for his masterpiece of horror. The stage was set for a crime so heinous that it would haunt America's nightmares for generations to come. The summer of 1928 burned hot and heavy across New York City, but no heat compared to the inferno of madness raging within Albert Fish's twisted mind. At 58 years old, the Gray Man had perfected his hunting techniques into a deadly art form that combined cunning intelligence with unimaginable cruelty. His victims had been mounting steadily, street children who wouldn't be missed, runaways whose disappearances would be blamed on the harsh realities of urban life. But Fish had grown bored with easy prey. The thrill of the hunt had become as important as the kill itself, and he craved a challenge that would test his skills as a predator. He wanted a victim from a loving family, someone whose disappearance would create the kind of anguish that fed his twisted soul almost as much as their flesh would feed his cannibalistic appetites. His hunting ground was the sprawling metropolis of New York, where millions of people created perfect camouflage for a monster who had learned to hide in plain sight. Fish had developed an intricate system for selecting his victims, spending weeks or even months studying potential targets before making his move. He would position himself near schools and playgrounds, watching children with the patience of a spider waiting for flies to become entangled in its web. He carried with him a canvas bag filled with the tools of his trade, lengths of rope that left no marks, chloroform-soaked rags that could silence screams in seconds, and razor-sharp knives that could separate flesh from bone with surgical precision. But his most powerful weapon was his appearance. The kindly old man who looked like he could barely hurt a fly, let alone commit acts of unthinkable horror. Fish had studied human psychology with the dedication of a scholar, learning exactly how to manipulate people's natural instincts and exploit their trust. He knew that parents taught their children to fear the obvious monsters, the men with wild eyes and threatening demeanors. They never warned them about the gentle grandfather who might offer to help find a lost kitten or share a piece of candy. His method was always the same. Approach with kindness, establish trust through gentle conversation, then isolate the victim before revealing his true nature. By the time his targets realized they were in danger, they were already trapped in a nightmare from which there would be no escape. The first confirmed kill that would establish his reputation as the Gray Man occurred in 1924, when Fish encountered a young boy named Billy Gaffney playing alone near his apartment building in Brooklyn. Billy was 8 years old, with bright eyes and an entrusting smile that made him the perfect victim for Fish's twisted appetites. Fish approached the boy with a story about needing help finding his lost dog. Billy, eager to help and completely unaware of the danger he was in, followed the kindly old man into an abandoned building where Fish's true nature was finally revealed. What happened to Billy Gaffney in that hellish place would remain Fish's secret for years, but witnesses later reported hearing screams that seemed to go on forever, sounds so horrifying that they haunted the neighborhood for months afterward. When Billy's mutilated remains were finally discovered weeks later, even hardened police detectives were sickened by what they found. The boy's body bore evidence of torture so extensive and creative that it defied human comprehension. Fish had taken his time with Billy, stretching the agony out over days while he slowly consumed pieces of the child's flesh, keeping him alive and conscious for as long as possible to savor every moment of his victim's terror. But Billy Gaffney was just the beginning. Fish's confidence had been boosted by the successful completion of his most elaborate kill yet, and he began hunting with increasing frequency and boldness. His victims were always children, always vulnerable, always chosen for their innocence and the devastating impact their disappearance would have on their families. Francis X. McDonnell was next, a 14-year-old boy whose only crime was being in the wrong place when the Gray Man was hunting. Fish had been stalking Francis for weeks, learning his routines, discovering when he would be most vulnerable. The boy's death was even more horrific than Billy's, as Fish had refined his techniques and discovered new depths of cruelty that even he hadn't known he possessed. Fish's method of disposing of bodies became increasingly sophisticated as his kill count rose. He would often transport remains to remote locations where they might never be found, or he would burn them in specially constructed furnaces that reduced bone and flesh to ash that could be scattered without leaving evidence. When bodies were discovered, they were often so mutilated and decomposed that identification was impossible. The psychological profile that would later emerge painted Fish as a predator who derived pleasure from every aspect of his crimes: the hunting, the capture, the torture, the killing, and even the disposal of remains. He kept detailed journals describing his methods and his feelings during each phase of his attacks, writing with the enthusiasm of a gourmet describing a perfect meal. His apartment became a museum of horror, filled with newspaper clippings about missing children, photographs of potential victims, and detailed maps marking locations where he had successfully hunted in the past. He would spend hours studying these materials, reliving his crimes in exquisite detail while planning future attacks. Fish's hunting territory expanded as his confidence grew. He traveled throughout New York and into neighboring states, always careful to vary his patterns to avoid detection. He would sometimes assume different identities, using fake names and forged documents to establish temporary residences in new hunting grounds. The Gray Man's reputation began to spread through whispered conversations among law enforcement officers who had encountered the aftermath of his crimes. They spoke of crime scenes so disturbing that veteran detectives required psychological counseling afterward, of evidence so heinous that it was kept classified to prevent public panic. But Fish's greatest triumph, and ultimately the crime that would lead to his downfall, was still to come. He had been planning something special, a kidnapping and murder so perfectly executed and so thoroughly documented that it would cement his place in the annals of criminal history. The target he selected was Grace Budd, a 10-year-old girl from a working-class family in Manhattan. Grace was everything Fish looked for in a victim. Young, innocent, trusting, and from a family that would be devastated by her loss. She had golden hair and bright blue eyes that sparkled with the kind of pure joy that Fish found irresistible. Fish spent months preparing for Grace's abduction, studying her family's routines, learning about their financial situation, and crafting the perfect deception that would allow him to gain their trust. He created an elaborate false identity as Frank Howard, a wealthy farmer from Long Island who was looking for help with his property. The plan he devised was masterful in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. He would present himself as a benefactor offering employment to Grace's older brother, using this pretext to ingratiate himself with the family and gain access to their home. Once he had established trust, he would find an opportunity to isolate Grace and spirit her away to a location where he could take all the time he needed to satisfy his twisted appetites. As spring turned to summer in 1928, Albert Fish put his plan into motion, completely unaware that this crime would be the one that finally brought his reign of terror to an end. The Gray Man was about to claim his most famous victim, but he was also about to make the mistake that would lead him to the electric chair. The hunt for Grace Budd was about to begin, and with it, the most notorious kidnapping and murder case in American criminal history. June 3, 1928, dawned clear and bright over Manhattan, but for the Budd family, this Sunday would mark the end of innocence and the beginning of a nightmare that would consume their lives for years to come. Grace Budd woke that morning with the carefree joy of a 10-year-old who had no reason to fear the world around her. She had no way of knowing that a monster had been watching her family, studying their habits, and preparing to tear her from everything she loved. Albert Fish had been planning this abduction for months with the meticulous care of a military strategist. Every detail had been considered, every contingency planned for, every aspect of the deception crafted to perfection. He had created the identity of Frank Howard, a kindly farmer from Farmingdale, Long Island, complete with references and a believable backstory that would allow him to gain the trust of Grace's family. The Budd family lived in a modest apartment on West 15th Street, struggling to make ends meet like so many working-class families during the difficult economic times of the late 1920s. Albert Budd, Grace's father, worked as a doorman, while his wife Delia tried to manage their household and care for their 4 children on a painfully tight budget. Fish had initially made contact with the family through their 18-year-old son, Edward, who had placed a classified advertisement seeking employment. The Gray Man saw this as the perfect opportunity to insinuate himself into their lives, and he crafted a response that would appeal to a desperate young man looking for work. In his letter, Frank Howard presented himself as a successful farmer who needed reliable help with his 600-acre property. He offered wages that seemed almost too good to be true: $15 a week plus room and board, a fortune for a working-class family in 1928. The letter was perfectly written, conveying just the right mixture of businesslike professionalism and grandfatherly warmth that would put any family at ease. When Fish arrived at the Budd apartment that fateful Sunday, he was the picture of respectable prosperity. He wore a well-tailored suit, carried himself with the dignified bearing of a successful businessman, and spoke with the kind of refined diction that commanded immediate respect. To the Budd family, He seemed like an answer to their prayers, a wealthy gentleman who could provide their son with the kind of opportunity that might lift them out of poverty. Fish had calculated every aspect of his appearance and demeanor to maximum effect. His gray hair was neatly combed. His clothes were expensive but not ostentatious, and he carried a gold watch that suggested financial success without appearing flashy. He spoke with authority about farming and business matters, demonstrating a knowledge that convinced the buds he was exactly who he claimed to be. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, the monster was already savoring what was to come. As Fish sat in the Bud family's modest living room, discussing employment terms with Edward, his eyes were constantly drawn to little Grace, who played quietly in the corner with her younger brother. He studied every detail of her appearance. The way her golden hair caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, the innocent trust in her bright blue eyes, the graceful way she moved as she played with her toys. Fish engaged Grace in conversation, drawing her out with the skill of a predator who had perfected the art of gaining children's trust. He complimented her dress, asked about her favorite games, and listened with apparent fascination to her childish chatter about school and friends. To her parents, he seemed like a kindly grandfather figure who genuinely enjoyed children's company. As the afternoon progressed, Fish began to implement the next phase of his plan. He mentioned that his sister was hosting a children's party at her home in Chelsea and suggested that Grace might enjoy attending. The invitation seemed harmless enough. What parent wouldn't want their child to experience the kind of party that wealthy families could afford? Fish described the party in elaborate detail, painting pictures of wonderful games, delicious food, and children from the finest families in the city. He spoke of pony rides and a magician, of cakes and ice cream and gifts for all the children. His description was so vivid and enticing that Grace's eyes lit up with excitement at the prospect of such an adventure. Delia Budd was initially hesitant to let her daughter go with a stranger, but Fish had anticipated this resistance and was prepared for it. He presented himself as a family friend now, someone who had already demonstrated his trustworthiness by offering employment to their son. He showed them letters of reference, spoke knowledgeably about mutual acquaintances, and gradually wore down their natural caution with persistent charm and apparent respectability. The final stroke of genius in Fish's deception was his suggestion that Grace's parents accompany them to the party. This offer seemed to eliminate any possible danger. What kidnapper would invite witnesses along? Of course, Fish had no intention of actually taking the parents, but the offer itself was enough to convince them that his motives were purely innocent. When the time came to leave, Fish had prepared for the next phase of his deception. He claimed that his car had broken down just around the corner and suggested that they walk to his sister's house, which he said was only a few blocks away. Once they were on the street, he would claim to have forgotten the address, then suggest that Grace come with him to find it while her parents waited. But the parents had decided at the last minute not to come, trusting their daughter to the care of a man who seemed so obviously respectable and kind. As Fish led Grace away from her home that afternoon, her mother watched from the window with no sense of impending doom, thinking only that her daughter was about to enjoy a wonderful party with children from wealthy families. Grace skipped along beside Fish as they walked through the streets of Manhattan, chattering excitedly about the party and asking questions about the other children she would meet. Fish answered patiently, maintaining his gentle facade while his mind raced with anticipation of what was to come. He had brought with him a small travel bag containing rope, chloroform, and several knives, all concealed beneath a layer of legitimate traveling supplies. Their destination wasn't a party in Chelsea, but an abandoned house in Westchester County that Fish had prepared specifically for this occasion. He had scouted the location carefully, ensuring that it was isolated enough for his purposes but still accessible by public transportation. The house had been empty for years, its windows boarded up and its yard overgrown with weeds that provided natural camouflage. As they traveled further from the city, Grace began to ask questions about when they would arrive at the party. Fish assured her that they were almost there, pointing out landmarks and making up stories about the magnificent house where the party was being held. His voice remained calm and reassuring, even as his heart raced with the anticipation of what he was about to do. When they finally reached the abandoned house, Fish's demeanor began to change subtly. He became quieter, more focused, like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Grace, still trusting and unaware of any danger, followed him toward the house, asking why it looked so dark and empty. It was then that Fish dropped his mask completely. His voice changed from grandfatherly kindness to something cold and predatory as he told Grace that there was no party, that her parents had sold her to him, and that she would never see her family again. The terror in her eyes, as she realized her situation, fed something dark and hungry within Fish's twisted soul. What happened next in that abandoned house was too horrific for any civilized mind to fully comprehend. Fish had planned every detail of Grace's ordeal, intending to stretch her suffering out over days or even weeks. He had prepared the house with restraints, tools of torture, and cooking facilities that would allow him to satisfy all of his twisted appetites. The crime that followed was so depraved, so thoroughly evil in its conception and execution, that it would haunt investigators for the rest of their lives. Fish documented every moment of Grace's torture and death with photographs and detailed written accounts that revealed depths of human evil that most people couldn't imagine. Grace Budd died in that house after enduring tortures that belonged in the darkest corners of hell itself. But her death was only the beginning of Fish's desecration of her memory. What he did with her remains afterward would prove that some human beings could sink to depths of depravity that challenged the very concept of humanity itself. The Gray Man had claimed his most famous victim, but he had also planted the seeds of his own destruction. For 6 years, the disappearance of Grace Budd haunted New York City like a malevolent specter, a mystery that consumed police resources and tormented a grieving family who never stopped hoping for answers. The investigation had grown cold, with hundreds of leads that led nowhere and countless false confessions from attention seekers and madmen. But Albert Fish, the Gray Man who had stolen their daughter's life, remained a shadow in the wind, continuing his reign of terror while the world searched desperately for a killer they couldn't even imagine. During those 6 years, Fish's appetite for human flesh and suffering had only grown more refined and terrible. The successful abduction and murder of Grace Budd had given him a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and he began taking greater risks with each subsequent kill. His victim count climbed steadily, though many of his crimes went undetected or were attributed to other causes. Fish had developed an intricate system for selecting and stalking his prey, often spending months studying potential victims before making his move. He would create detailed dossiers on children and their families, complete with photographs, daily schedules, and personality profiles that helped him determine the best approach for each abduction. His killing methods had evolved into a horrifying art form that combined psychological torture with physical mutilation in ways that maximized both suffering and his own twisted pleasure. He had perfected techniques for keeping victims alive and conscious during prolonged periods of torture, using a combination of medical knowledge and sadistic creativity that allowed him to stretch out their agony for days or even weeks. The basement of his various residences became laboratories of horror where Fish conducted his experiments in pain and death. He had accumulated an extensive collection of torture devices, some purchased from underground sources and others crafted by his own hands with the skill of a master craftsman. Every tool was designed for a specific purpose, whether it was inflicting precise cuts, generating maximum pain, or keeping victims alive longer than nature intended. But it was Fish's cannibalistic practices that truly set him apart from other serial killers of his era. He had developed elaborate rituals around the consumption of human flesh, treating each meal as a sacrament in his twisted religion of pain and death. He would prepare the meat with the same care that a gourmet chef might lavish on a prize cut of beef, seasoning it with herbs and cooking it to what he considered perfection. Fish kept detailed journals describing the taste and texture of different types of human flesh, rating his victims based on age, gender, and physical condition. He claimed that children tasted the sweetest, particularly when they had been properly terrorized before death, as fear somehow enhanced the flavor of their meat. The psychological aspects of Fish's crimes were often more disturbing than the physical violence itself. He would spend hours talking to his victims before killing them, describing in vivid detail what he planned to do to their bodies both before and after death. He seemed to derive as much pleasure from their psychological torment as he did from their physical suffering. But Fish's greatest weakness was his compulsion to document and share his crimes. He was driven by an overwhelming need for recognition, a desire to have the world acknowledge the scope of his evil genius. This narcissistic trait would ultimately prove to be his downfall, leading him to make contact with the one family whose grief and determination would never allow them to give up the search for their daughter's killer. On November 11, 1934, more than 6 years after Grace Budd's disappearance, the Budd family received a letter that would finally bring them the answers they had been desperately seeking. The letter was written in Albert Fish's careful handwriting, though he had signed it with a false name in a pathetic attempt to avoid detection. The contents of that letter were so horrifying, so graphically detailed in their description of Grace's final hours, that they defied human comprehension. Fish described every aspect of her abduction, torture, and death with the enthusiasm of a connoisseur discussing a particularly fine wine. He detailed how he had cooked and consumed her flesh, describing the taste and texture with revolting precision. But Fish had made a critical error in his desperate need for recognition. The letter had been written on stationery that bore a distinctive watermark, and the envelope contained traces of a unique type of ink that could be traced to its manufacturer. More importantly, Fish's compulsive need to boast about his crimes had led him to include details about Grace's death that only her killer could have known. Detective William King, who had never given up on the Grace Budd case, immediately recognized the letter's significance. King was a veteran investigator whose dedication to solving the case had become legendary within the New York Police Department. He had followed hundreds of dead-end leads over the years, but something about this letter told him that he had finally found his killer. The investigation that followed demonstrated the power of methodical police work combined with unwavering determination. King traced the stationery to a small manufacturer in Pennsylvania, then followed the distribution chain to identify every store that had sold that particular type of paper. The ink was traced to a specific formula used by only a handful of pen manufacturers during a limited time period. But it was the letter itself that provided the most valuable clues. Fish's handwriting was distinctive, with characteristics that suggested both advanced age and possible mental illness. His word choices and sentence structure painted a psychological profile that helped investigators understand the type of man they were hunting. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that the letter had been mailed from a location near a boarding house where Fish had been staying under an assumed name. When they arrived at the boarding house, Fish had already fled, but he had left behind evidence that confirmed his identity and provided crucial information about his background and possible whereabouts. The manhunt that followed was unlike anything New York had ever seen. Police departments across multiple states coordinated their efforts, sharing information and resources in an unprecedented display of law enforcement cooperation. Fish's photograph was distributed to every police station, post office, and railroad depot on the eastern seaboard. But Fish's capture, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. On December 13, 1934, he was arrested at a rooming house in Manhattan, not because of the massive manhunt, but because he had returned to collect a check that had been sent to his previous address. His compulsive need for money had overcome his survival instincts, leading him directly into the hands of the police who had been waiting for him. The arrest of Albert Fish sent shockwaves through American society. When details of his crimes began to emerge during his interrogation and trial, the public struggled to comprehend how such evil could exist in human form. Newspaper coverage was necessarily limited by the standards of public decency, but even the sanitized accounts that were published were enough to horrify readers across the nation. Fish's confession was a masterpiece of evil that revealed the true scope of his crimes for the first time. He admitted to murdering at least 15 children over a period of more than 20 years, though investigators believed the actual number was much higher. He provided details about crimes that had never been solved, leading police to the remains of victims who had been missing for years. The trial of Albert Fish became a media sensation that captivated the American public like few criminal cases before or since. The courtroom was packed daily with reporters, legal experts, and citizens who came to see the monster who had terrorized their city for decades. Fish seemed to enjoy the attention, often smiling and waving to the crowds as he was led to and from the courthouse. The defense team attempted to prove that Fish was legally insane, presenting evidence of his bizarre sexual practices, his history of mental illness, and the obvious depravity of his crimes. Psychiatrists testified about Fish's extensive collection of self-inflicted wounds, his practice of embedding needles in his own flesh, and his belief that he was following divine commands to kill and consume children. But the prosecution, led by District Attorney Elbert Thomas, painted Fish as a calculating predator who knew exactly what he was doing and chose to commit his crimes despite understanding their consequences. They presented evidence of Fish's careful planning, his elaborate deceptions, and his ability to function normally in society while concealing his true nature. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. When asked if he had any final words before sentencing, Fish stood and delivered a rambling speech that revealed the depths of his madness, while confirming his complete lack of remorse for the lives he had destroyed. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison, bringing to an end one of the most horrifying crime sprees in American history. His final words were reportedly, "I don't even know why I'm here," a statement that seemed to encapsulate the complete disconnect between his actions and any rational understanding of morality or human decency. But Fish's death could never truly end the nightmare he had created. The families of his victims would carry their grief for the rest of their lives, and the investigators who had worked his cases would be haunted by the images and testimonies they had encountered. The gray man was finally gone, but the darkness he had unleashed upon the world would continue to cast shadows long after his execution. The case of Albert Fish remains one of the most studied examples of criminal psychology, a window into depths of human evil that most people prefer not to acknowledge exist. His crimes challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and forced society to confront the possibility that some individuals are simply born with an innate capacity for unspeakable evil. In the end, Albert Fish's legacy is one of unimaginable horror balanced against the tireless dedication of the law enforcement officers who refused to give up until justice was served. The gray man had claimed many victims during his reign of terror, but he could not ultimately escape the consequences of his actions. Evil may triumph for a time, but in the end, justice will always find a way to prevail. The nightmare was finally over, but its echoes would reverberate through American consciousness for generations to come. A reminder that monsters are real and that they sometimes wear the masks of harmless old men. Story 3. Jack the Ripper, the Whitechapel Terror. In the suffocating darkness of Victorian London's most wretched slums, where gaslight barely penetrated the choking fog and desperation hung in the air like a funeral shroud, something far more sinister than poverty prowled the cobblestone streets. Between August and November of 1888, the name Jack the Ripper would be carved into history not with ink, but with blood. Gallons of it, spilled in ways so savage, so methodically brutal, that even hardened police officers would flee crime scenes, retching into the gutters. This wasn't simply murder. This was artistry painted in human viscera, a symphony of screams that echoed through the narrow alleyways of Whitechapel, where 5 women, perhaps more, met deaths so horrific that their mutilated remains would haunt investigators for over a century. Tonight, we descend into the abyss of humanity's darkest impulses, where a shadow in a top hat wielded surgical precision to transform living, breathing women into grotesque exhibitions of anatomical horror. What you're about to witness isn't just the story of London's most notorious killer. It's a journey into the mind of a monster who turned murder into macabre performance art, leaving behind a legacy of terror that still chills the blood of anyone brave enough to walk Whitechapel streets after midnight. The autumn of 1888 descended upon London like a plague-bearer's cloak, heavy with the promise of death. In the labyrinthine streets of Whitechapel, where human misery had fermented into something thick and putrid, the air itself seemed to reek of impending doom. Here, in the belly of the world's greatest empire, 40,000 souls lived crammed into a single square mile of hell, a festering wound in the heart of civilization where hope came to die and nightmares took flesh. It was in this cesspool of human desperation that Jack the Ripper chose to conduct his symphony of slaughter, selecting his victims from among the most vulnerable members of society. Prostitutes whose lives had already been reduced to mere survival, women whose disappearance would barely ripple the surface of Victorian consciousness. But what the Ripper did to these women would send shockwaves through the very foundations of British society, transforming 5 forgotten souls into eternal symbols of humanity's capacity for unimaginable evil. Mary and Nichols, known to the streets as Polly, became the first note in this orchestration of agony. On the morning of August 31st, 1888, her body was discovered in Bucks Row, and what greeted the eyes of those who found her would haunt their dreams until their dying day. Polly lay sprawled across the cobblestones like a discarded marionette, her throat slashed so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her body. The wound gaped open like a crimson mouth, frozen in an eternal scream, with blood pooling beneath her in a grotesque halo that reflected the weak morning light. But the throat wound was merely the Ripper's opening statement. As investigators bent closer, fighting waves of nausea, they discovered that Polly's abdomen had been opened with surgical precision, her intestines partially drawn out and arranged with the care of a deranged artist. The killer had worked in complete darkness, yet every cut was deliberate, calculated, the work of someone who understood human anatomy with terrifying intimacy. The sight was so revolting that seasoned constables fled the scene, unable to contain their revulsion at this unprecedented display of savagery. The terror that gripped Whitechapel after Polly's murder was palpable, hanging over the district like a toxic fog. Women who had walked the streets with resigned acceptance of danger now huddled together in groups, their eyes darting constantly to the shadows that seemed to breathe with malevolent life. But their precautions would prove futile against a predator who moved like smoke through the darkness, selecting his prey with the patience of a spider in its web. Annie Chapman, known as Dark Annie for her swarthy complexion, became the Ripper's second masterpiece of horror on September 8, 1888. Her body was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, positioned in a grotesque tableau that suggested the killer had taken his time, working with the methodical precision of a surgeon performing an autopsy on a living patient. Annie's throat had been cut with such force that her head lolled at an impossible angle, connected to her body by mere strings of sinew and skin. Blood had fountained from the wound, painting the brick wall behind her in abstract patterns of crimson that would later be described by witnesses as resembling nothing so much as hellish graffiti. The true horror, however, lay in what the Ripper had done to Annie's body after death, or perhaps, given the evidence of her struggles, while she still clung to the last threads of life. Her abdomen had been opened from sternum to pelvis, the organs within removed with surgical precision and arranged around her body like offerings to some pagan deity of death. Her uterus had been completely excised and taken away, suggesting that the killer possessed not only anatomical knowledge but specific medical training that allowed him to locate and remove organs in near total darkness. Most disturbing of all were the personal items found arranged at Annie's feet. 2 brass rings from her fingers, a few pennies, and a piece of muslin, all laid out with ritualistic care that spoke to a mind that had crossed the boundary from mere violence into something far more sinister. A realm where murder became ceremony, where human flesh became canvas for artistic expression of the most depraved variety. The newspapers seized upon the killings with ghoulish enthusiasm, their headlines screaming sensationalistic accounts that both terrified and titillated Victorian readers. Horrible murder in Whitechapel blazoned across front pages, followed by increasingly hyperbolic descriptions of the crimes that fed a public appetite for darkness that had been carefully concealed beneath the veneer of respectability. The press coined the name Jack the Ripper after receiving a letter, likely a hoax, but one that captured the public imagination with its taunting tone and promise of more blood to come. Elizabeth Stride, known to her friends as Long Liz for her tall, elegant frame, met her fate on September 30th, 1888, in a killing that would later be known as part of the Ripper's most audacious night of terror. Her body was discovered in Dutfield's yard, and while her throat had been cut with the same savage efficiency that marked the other killings, her abdomen remained intact, leading investigators to theorize that the killer had been interrupted before he could complete his ghastly work. The wound to Elizabeth's throat was a testament to the Ripper's evolving technique and growing confidence. The cut ran so deep that it had severed her windpipe, larynx, and both carotid arteries, causing massive hemorrhaging that would have rendered her unconscious within seconds and dead within minutes. Yet witnesses reported that she had been alive and standing just moments before her body was found, suggesting that the Ripper had emerged from the shadows, performed his deadly work, and vanished back into the darkness with supernatural speed and silence. But if Elizabeth Stride's murder had been interrupted, the Ripper was far from finished with his night's work. Less than an hour later and barely a mile away, Catherine Eddowes would become the victim of what forensic experts would later describe as the most savage and methodical murder in the Ripper's catalog of horrors. Found in Mitre Square at 1:45 a.m., Catherine's body presented a scene so horrific that even experienced police surgeons struggled to document their findings without succumbing to violent illness. The killer had not merely murdered Catherine Eddowes. He had systematically dismantled her with the precision of a master butcher. Her throat had been cut so deeply that her head was attached to her body by the spinal column alone, while her abdomen had been opened and eviscerated with shocking thoroughness. The Ripper had removed her uterus, left kidney, and a significant portion of her small intestine, arranging the organs around her body in patterns that suggested both ritualistic intent and intimate knowledge of human anatomy. Most chilling of all was what the killer had done to Catherine's face. Using his knife with artistic precision, he had carved away sections of her nose, cheeks, and earlobes, creating a mask of horror that obliterated her human features and transformed her into something barely recognizable as having once been a living woman. The cuts were not random acts of frenzy but deliberate, calculated mutilations that spoke to a mind that found artistic expression in human suffering. The double event of September 30th sent Whitechapel into a state of absolute terror. Women barricaded themselves behind locked doors, while men formed vigilante patrols that prowled the streets with makeshift weapons, their eyes wild with fear and rage. The very air seemed to vibrate with tension, as if the district itself had become a living entity, breathing with the collective anxiety of 40,000 souls trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed no escape. Police resources were stretched to their breaking point as investigators struggled to comprehend the mind behind these atrocities. Medical experts were consulted, their opinions ranging from theories of homicidal mania to suggestions that the killer possessed formal surgical training, possibly as a doctor or anatomist. The precision of the cuts, the speed with which organs were removed, and the apparent knowledge of human anatomy displayed in each murder suggested an education that elevated these crimes beyond mere brutality into something approaching a perverted form of scientific inquiry. The investigation revealed disturbing patterns that would haunt criminal psychologists for generations to come. Each murder occurred under cover of darkness, in locations that provided quick escape routes while offering enough privacy for the killer to perform his ghastly work. The victims were all women of the lowest social class, their disappearance likely to go unnoticed until their mutilated remains were discovered hours later. Most unnervingly, witnesses reported seeing the victims alive and in conversation with men just minutes before their bodies were found, suggesting that the Ripper possessed a charm or persuasive ability that lured his victims to their doom willingly. The streets of Whitechapel became a hunting ground where every shadow might conceal death. Every footstep in the fog might herald the approach of the most feared predator in London's history. Children were forbidden from venturing out after dark, while adults moved in groups, their conversations conducted in whispers as if speaking too loudly might summon the killer from whatever hellish realm he inhabited between murders. As October progressed with no arrest, no leads, and no end to the terror in sight, the residents of Whitechapel began to understand a horrible truth. They were not dealing with an ordinary criminal who might be caught through conventional police work. They were trapped in the web of a predator who had evolved beyond human understanding, a creature that had learned to weaponize the very darkness itself, turning the familiar streets of their neighborhood into a labyrinth of death from which there seemed no escape. The stage was set for what would become the Ripper's masterpiece of horror, a final act so shocking, so utterly depraved, that it would cement his legacy as not merely London's most notorious killer, but as the architect of a new age of terror that would redefine humanity's understanding of evil itself. November in Whitechapel arrived like a funeral shroud, heavy with the weight of accumulated dread and the metallic taste of spilled blood that seemed to hang perpetually in the air. The fog rolled in from the Thames with unusual thickness, transforming the already maze-like streets into a supernatural realm where reality and nightmare merged into one suffocating entity. It was in this atmosphere of absolute terror that Jack the Ripper would create his ultimate work of horror, a display of calculated savagery so complete, so methodically brutal, that it would traumatize even the most hardened investigators and establish a new benchmark for human cruelty that remains unmatched to this day. Mary Jane Kelly, just 25 years old and possessed of a beauty that had not yet been completely eroded by the grinding poverty of Whitechapel life, became the canvas for what forensic experts would later describe as the most thorough and systematic destruction of a human being ever documented. Unlike the Ripper's previous victims, Mary Kelly would meet her fate not in the anonymous darkness of a street or yard, but in the supposed sanctuary of her own room at 13 Miller's Court, a fact that would prove to offer no protection against a killer who had evolved beyond the constraints of opportunity into something approaching the supernatural in his ability to transform living flesh into monuments of terror. The morning of November 9, 1888, dawned gray and oppressive, with a quality of light that seemed filtered through the very essence of despair. Thomas Bowyer, sent to collect overdue rent from Mary Kelly's room, approached the grimy window of 13 Miller's Court with the resigned attitude of a man accustomed to the squalor and chaos of Whitechapel life. What he glimpsed through the broken pane, however, would shatter his sanity and haunt his nightmares until his death decades later. The scene that greeted Bowyer's eyes was so far beyond the realm of normal human experience that his mind initially refused to process what he was seeing. The small room had been transformed into something resembling an anatomical theater conceived in hell itself, where every surface told a story of unimaginable suffering and methodical destruction. Mary Kelly's body, or what remained of it, lay spread across the bed in pieces, arranged with the precision of a surgeon's display and the artistic sensibility of a madman who found beauty in the complete annihilation of human form. When police investigators finally gained entry to the room, the scene that confronted them would later be described by Commissioner Sir Charles Warren as the most sickening sight he had witnessed in 30 years of police work. Mary Kelly had not simply been murdered. She had been systematically disassembled with a thoroughness that suggested the killer had spent hours in the room, working with the unhurried precision of an anatomist conducting a leisurely dissection. The Ripper's blade had opened Mary's throat so completely that her head was attached to her torso by vertebrae alone, the wound gaping like a second mouth that seemed to mock the investigators with its silent scream. But this initial cut, devastating as it was, served merely as the opening movement in an orchestra of destruction that would transform every inch of Mary Kelly's body into a testament to humanity's capacity for absolute evil. Her abdomen had been opened from sternum to pelvis and completely emptied, the organs within removed with surgical precision and arranged around the room like grotesque decorations celebrating some pagan festival of death. Her heart had been cut out and placed on the pillow beside her head, while her liver lay between her feet, positioned with the same careful attention to detail that a florist might use when arranging flowers. The uterus and kidneys had been placed beneath her head, creating a macabre pillow that elevated her severed features above the carnage like the centerpiece of a demonic altar. The killer's attention to Mary Kelly's face revealed a level of personal sadism that distinguished this murder from his previous works. Using his knife with the precision of a sculptor, he had systematically removed her nose, cheeks, eyebrows, and ears, stripping away every feature that had once made her recognizable as Mary Jane Kelly, or indeed as human at all. The cuts were not random acts of frenzy but deliberate artistry, each slice calculated to erase another piece of the woman's identity until what remained was less a person than an abstract representation of suffering made flesh. Her limbs had been systematically removed and repositioned, her arms placed at impossible angles while her legs were bent and arranged in positions that defied the normal mechanics of human anatomy. The killer had flayed large sections of skin from her thighs and abdomen, hanging the strips from the bedposts like grotesque bunting, while muscle tissue had been carved away and arranged in patterns that suggested both anatomical knowledge and an artistic sensibility twisted beyond all recognition. The room itself bore witness to the duration and intensity of the killer's work. Blood covered every surface, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, creating an abstract expressionist nightmare that spoke to hours of methodical butchery. Handprints in blood marked the walls, some appearing to be the Ripper's own as he moved around the room, working with the patience of a craftsman perfecting his masterpiece. The bed beneath Mary's remains was soaked through to the mattress, the blood having pooled and congealed into a substance that investigators described as resembling nothing so much as black pudding. Most disturbing of all was the evidence that Mary Kelly had been alive for at least part of this systematic destruction. Medical examination revealed defensive wounds on her hands and arms, suggesting she had fought desperately against her attacker before succumbing to injuries that would have taken considerable time to inflict. The pattern of blood spatter indicated that her heart had continued beating well into the mutilation process, pumping her life's essence across the walls of her small room until the very last drop had been squeezed from her tortured form. The killer had taken his time with Mary Kelly, working with a leisurely precision that suggested he felt completely safe from discovery or interruption. Unlike his previous murders, which had been accomplished in minutes under the constant threat of discovery, this final atrocity had been conducted over the course of hours, allowing the Ripper to indulge every twisted impulse that had been building within him since his reign of terror began. Dr. Thomas Bond, the police surgeon who examined Mary Kelly's remains, would later write in his official report that the scene represented the work of a maniac who had completely lost all self-control. Yet the very precision of the mutilation suggested exactly the opposite: a killer in complete control of his faculties, working with the methodical patience of a master craftsman who had finally been given unlimited time to perfect his art of human destruction. The investigation of Mary Kelly's murder revealed disturbing details about the killer's methods and mindset. Witnesses reported hearing screams from her room in the early hours of November 9th, followed by an eerie silence that seemed to blanket the entire court. The fact that no one investigated these sounds spoke to the atmosphere of terror that had paralyzed Whitechapel. Residents had learned to ignore screams in the night, knowing that curiosity might make them the next victim of the monster that stalked their streets. The killer had gained entry to Mary Kelly's room with apparent ease, suggesting either that she knew him well enough to admit him willingly, or that he possessed skills that allowed him to defeat locks and barriers without detection. Once inside, he had taken the time to light a fire in the small grate, providing illumination for his work while simultaneously creating a means to dispose of evidence. Charred remains found in the fireplace included pieces of women's clothing that had been systematically burned, suggesting the killer had used some of Mary's garments to fuel his pyre of destruction. The medical evidence suggested that the Ripper had brought additional tools to this murder beyond his usual knife. The precision of the bone cuts and the systematic removal of organs indicated the use of surgical instruments, possibly including bone saws and scalpels that allowed him to work with unprecedented thoroughness. This escalation in equipment suggested a killer who was not merely evolving his technique, but preparing for what he may have intended as his masterpiece. The psychological profile that emerged from Mary Kelly's murder painted a picture of a predator who had transcended ordinary criminal behavior and entered a realm of pure evil that defied conventional understanding. The time taken, the artistic arrangement of body parts, and the systematic erasure of the victim's humanity spoke to a mind that found aesthetic pleasure in human suffering and viewed murder as a form of creative expression. The impact of Mary Kelly's murder on Whitechapel was immediate and devastating. The district, already paralyzed by fear, descended into a state of absolute terror that resembled nothing so much as a medieval village under siege by supernatural forces. Women refused to venture out alone under any circumstances, while men formed armed patrols that roamed the streets with weapons drawn, ready to attack anyone who moved suspiciously through the fog-shrouded alleys. The press coverage of Mary Kelly's murder reached heights of sensationalism that had never before been seen in British journalism. Newspapers competed to provide the most graphic descriptions of the scene, their lurid accounts feeding a public appetite for horror that seemed to grow with each new atrocity. The name Jack the Ripper became synonymous with evil itself, a bogeyman who stalked not just the streets of Whitechapel but the nightmares of an entire nation. Police resources were overwhelmed by the investigation, with detectives following hundreds of leads that led nowhere and interviewing thousands of suspects who melted away like smoke when confronted with actual evidence. The Ripper seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere, a phantom who could strike without warning and vanish without trace, leaving behind only the scattered remains of his victims and the certainty that he would kill again. As November progressed without arrest or resolution, the residents of Whitechapel began to understand that they were trapped in a nightmare from which there might be no awakening. The monster that hunted them had proven himself capable of horrors beyond imagination, and his latest masterpiece suggested that his appetite for destruction was not diminishing but growing stronger with each act of violence. The stage was set for what many believed would be an escalation of terror that would ultimately consume not just Whitechapel, but all of London itself, as Jack the Ripper prepared to expand his hunting ground and perfect his art of human destruction on an unprecedented scale. December 1888 descended upon London like the breath of death itself, carrying with it an atmosphere of dread so thick and suffocating that it seemed to seep through the very stones of Whitechapel's blood-soaked streets. The mutilated remains of Mary Jane Kelly had barely been scraped from the walls of 13 Miller's Court before the full weight of what had transpired began to settle over the city like a plague cloud. The Ripper's masterpiece of human destruction had shattered every assumption about the limits of criminal behavior, transforming him from a mere killer into something approaching mythology, a figure so steeped in horror that his very name had become synonymous with evil incarnate. The investigation that followed Mary Kelly's annihilation revealed the terrifying scope of the police's helplessness in the face of a predator who seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of human understanding. Inspector Frederick Aberline, the seasoned detective assigned to lead the Ripper investigation, found himself confronting not merely a criminal case, but a descent into madness that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of evil. The evidence, or rather, the systematic absence of useful evidence, painted a picture of a killer who had achieved an almost supernatural ability to move through London's streets like smoke, leaving behind only the scattered remains of his victims and the growing certainty that he would strike again. The Metropolitan Police, already stretched thin by the demands of maintaining order in a city seething with social unrest, found themselves overwhelmed by a case that seemed to grow more impossible with each passing day. Hundreds of officers were deployed throughout Whitechapel, their presence creating an atmosphere of martial law that did nothing to calm the terror of residents who understood that the killer had already demonstrated his ability to operate with impunity under the very noses of law enforcement. The streets filled with uniformed constables walking in pairs, their footsteps echoing through the fog-shrouded alleys like the measured tread of mourners at a funeral procession. Yet, for all their numbers and determination, the police found themselves chasing shadows, quite literally, as witness reports flooded in describing suspicious figures glimpsed in the periphery of gaslight, mysterious men who seemed to melt into the darkness the moment they were observed. The descriptions varied wildly. Some witnesses reported seeing a well-dressed gentleman with a medical bag. Others described a rough-looking laborer with blood on his hands. Still others swore they had encountered a foreign-looking man whose eyes held depths of malevolence that haunted their dreams. The only consistent element in these accounts was the sense of wrongness that seemed to emanate from the figure, an aura of corruption so profound that even the most hardened residents of Whitechapel's slums instinctively recoiled from his presence. The letters began arriving at newspaper offices and police stations with increasing frequency, each one claiming to be from the hand of Jack the Ripper himself. Written in a variety of hands and styles, they taunted investigators with promises of more bloodshed to come, boasting of past murders and threatening atrocities that would make previous killings seem like mere rehearsals for the symphony of destruction yet to unfold. The famous From Hell letter, accompanied by a piece of human kidney that forensic analysis suggested had been removed from Catherine Eddowes, arrived at the offices of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee like a message from the abyss itself. From hell, the letter began, written in a shaky hand that seemed to tremble with barely contained excitement. Mr. Lusk, sor I send you half the kidna I took from one woman, preserved it for you tother piece I fried and ate it was very knees. The casual mention of cannibalism, delivered with the tone of a dinner invitation, sent shock waves through an investigation already reeling from the systematic escalation of violence. If genuine, and handwriting experts remained divided. The letter suggested that the Ripper's perversions extended beyond mere murder and mutilation into realms of depravity that challenged the very foundations of civilized society. The press, meanwhile, had transformed the Ripper investigation into a feeding frenzy of sensationalism that rivaled the killer's own appetite for destruction. Newspapers competed to provide the most lurid details of each murder, their headlines growing more hyperbolic with each edition. "The Whitechapel Demon Strikes Again," screamed the London Evening News, while the Star promised readers exclusive details of the fiend's latest atrocity. The coverage fed a public appetite for horror that seemed to grow with each new revelation, creating a symbiotic relationship between the killer's actions and the media's insatiable hunger for content that would sell papers by shocking readers out of their comfortable complacency. This media circus had unintended consequences that rippled far beyond the boundaries of Whitechapel itself. Reports of the murders spread throughout the British Empire and beyond, carrying the Ripper's reputation to every corner of the civilized world and transforming him into history's first truly international serial killer. Letters claiming to be from Jack the Ripper began arriving at police stations in cities across Europe and America, while copycat killings emerged in locations as distant as Australia and Canada. The methods pioneered in London's East End were being replicated by disturbed individuals who saw in the Ripper's work a template for their own descent into murderous madness. The investigation revealed disturbing patterns that suggested the killer's evolution from opportunistic predator to something approaching a force of nature. Analysis of the crime scenes showed increasing sophistication in the killer's methods, with each murder demonstrating improved technique and greater confidence. The progression from Mary and Nichols' relatively straightforward throat slashing to Mary Kelly's systematic dismemberment represented a learning curve that spoke to a mind constantly refining its approach to human destruction. Medical experts consulted by police offered theories that ranged from the plausible to the fantastical. Dr. Thomas Bond, the police surgeon, concluded that the killer possessed no scientific nor anatomical knowledge, suggesting that the apparent surgical skill demonstrated in the murders was merely the result of butchery experience or meat-cutting expertise. Other medical professionals disagreed vehemently, pointing to the precision with which organs had been removed and the apparent knowledge of human anatomy required to navigate the body's internal structures in near-total darkness. The most disturbing theory came from Dr. Edgar Shepard, who suggested that the killer might be suffering from a form of religious mania that drove him to view his murders as sacred acts of purification. This theory gained credence when investigators discovered that several of the victims had been positioned in poses that resembled religious iconography, their mutilated forms arranged with the careful attention to detail of a monk illuminating a manuscript. The possibility that the Ripper viewed his murders as acts of divine service added a theological dimension to the investigation that transformed the case from criminal inquiry into something approaching a battle between good and evil. As winter deepened and no arrests were made, vigilante groups began forming throughout Whitechapel, their members armed with everything from kitchen knives to shotguns. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, led by George Lusk, organized patrols that roamed the streets in groups, their eyes wild with a mixture of fear and bloodlust that made them nearly as dangerous as the killer they sought. These amateur investigators followed false leads with religious fervor, beating suspected foreigners and anyone whose behavior seemed even remotely suspicious. The atmosphere of paranoia grew so intense that longtime residents began viewing their neighbors with suspicion, wondering if the man next door might be the monster who had terrorized their community for months. The economic impact of the murders rippled through Whitechapel's already fragile infrastructure like a disease. Tourism to the area increased as morbid curiosity seekers flocked to see the sites where the murders had occurred, but legitimate businesses fled, taking with them the jobs that many residents depended upon for survival. Property values plummeted as landlords found it impossible to rent rooms in buildings where tenants lived in constant fear of becoming the Ripper's next victim. The district began to take on the characteristics of a ghost town, with entire streets emptying after dark and normally bustling pubs closing their doors rather than risk attracting the attention of a killer who seemed to view crowded areas as hunting grounds. The investigation expanded beyond Whitechapel as police considered the possibility that the Ripper might strike in other areas of London. Additional patrols were deployed throughout the East End, while wealthy neighborhoods hired private security firms to protect their residents from a killer whose social background remained a complete mystery. The class implications of the murders. All victims had been poor women whose deaths would normally have merited barely a paragraph in the press, created uncomfortable questions about British society's treatment of its most vulnerable members. International attention brought unwanted scrutiny to British law enforcement methods, with foreign journalists painting Scotland Yard as incompetent buffoons incapable of catching a single killer despite deploying vast resources and manpower. The criticism stung particularly because it contained elements of truth. Despite months of investigation, hundreds of interviews, and the deployment of the most advanced forensic techniques available in 1888, police were no closer to identifying the Ripper than they had been after the first murder. The killer seemed to exist in a realm beyond normal criminal investigation, a phantom who struck without warning and vanished without trace. The psychological toll on investigators became increasingly apparent as the case dragged on without resolution. Inspector Aberline, once considered one of Scotland Yard's most capable detectives, began showing signs of the strain that came from confronting evil in its purest form. His reports grew increasingly desperate, filled with theories that bordered on the supernatural and expressions of frustration that revealed a man pushed to the very limits of his sanity. Other investigators requested transfers or took sick leave, unable to continue working on a case that seemed designed to drive men mad through exposure to humanity's darkest impulses. As 1888 drew to a close, the residents of Whitechapel found themselves trapped in a nightmare that showed no signs of ending. The killer had demonstrated his ability to strike with impunity, to transform human beings into grotesque art installations, and to vanish into the fog like a creature from the realm of myth and legend. His reign of terror had redefined what was possible in terms of criminal behavior, establishing new benchmarks for human cruelty that would haunt the collective unconscious for generations to come. The stage was set for what many believed would be an escalation of violence that would ultimately consume not just Whitechapel, but all of London. The Ripper had tasted blood and found it sweet. He had discovered the intoxicating power that came from holding life and death in his hands, and he had proven that even in the heart of the world's greatest empire, there existed places where evil could flourish unchecked and monsters could hunt with the confidence of apex predators stalking helpless prey. The new year of 1889 arrived in Whitechapel like a false dawn, carrying with it whispered prayers from residents who dared to hope that the nightmare might finally be ending. January passed without a murder bearing the Ripper's distinctive signature, then February, then March, until even the most paranoid inhabitants of London's bloodiest district began to wonder if their tormentor had finally vanished into whatever hellish realm had spawned him. But this apparent cessation of violence brought no peace, only a different kind of terror. The knowledge that somewhere in the labyrinthine city, a monster walked among ordinary citizens, indistinguishable from law-abiding men until the moment he chose to reveal his true nature through acts of unimaginable brutality. The investigation continued with desperate intensity, even as the trail grew colder with each passing day. Inspector Frederick Aberline, his hair now streaked with gray that had appeared seemingly overnight during the height of the terror, pursued every lead with the obsession of a man who understood that failure to catch the Ripper would define not only his career but his very identity as a guardian of civilization against the forces of chaos. His office at Scotland Yard resembled nothing so much as the lair of a madman, its walls covered with photographs of crime scenes, anatomical diagrams, maps marked with the locations of murders, and hundreds of letters claiming to be from Jack the Ripper's own hand. The suspects multiplied like cancer cells, each new theory spawning dozens of false leads that consumed precious resources and investigative time. Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher whose body was found floating in the Thames in December 1888, became a prime suspect after his suicide note referenced, "The best thing for me was to die," leading investigators to wonder if guilt over the Ripper murders had driven him to take his own life. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant whose deteriorating mental state had been observed by neighbors, fit the profile of a foreign-born killer that many investigators favored. Michael Ostrog, a confidence trickster with a history of violence against women, had been in and out of asylums for much of the 1880s, his whereabouts during the murders remaining frustratingly unclear. But perhaps the most compelling and terrifying suspect was Dr. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor whose hatred of women was legendary among those who knew him. Tumblety had been in London during the murders, possessing both the anatomical knowledge and the surgical instruments that could explain the precision with which the Ripper had dismembered his victims. His collection of wounds preserved in jars, discovered by investigators after his arrest on charges of gross indecency, suggested a pathological obsession with female anatomy that aligned perfectly with the Ripper's apparent fetishization of his victims' reproductive organs. When Tumblety fled London for America shortly after the final murder, investigators wondered if they had inadvertently allowed their quarry to escape justice by pursuing other leads. The royal conspiracy theory, whispered in the drawing rooms of London's elite, suggested that the murders had been committed to cover up a scandal involving Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria. According to this theory, the prince had secretly married a Catholic shop girl named Annie Crook, and the Ripper murders were orchestrated by Sir William Gull, the royal physician, to eliminate witnesses who could expose the marriage and threaten the Protestant succession. The theory painted a picture of institutional evil that reached to the very heart of the British establishment. suggesting that the most powerful figures in the realm were capable of sanctioning mass murder to protect their secrets. Yet, for all the theories and speculation, the truth remained as elusive as the killer himself. The Ripper seemed to exist in a realm beyond normal human understanding, a figure who could appear and disappear at will, leaving behind only the mutilated remains of his victims and questions that would torment investigators for decades to come. The case files grew thicker with each passing month, filled with false confessions, spurious leads, and theories that ranged from the plausible to the absurd. Yet the identity of Jack the Ripper remained locked away in whatever twisted psyche had conceived and executed the Whitechapel murders. As months turned to years without another canonical murder, a different kind of horror began to emerge from the investigation's failure. The realization that the Ripper had simply stopped killing, whether through death, imprisonment for other crimes, or emigration to distant shores, meant that justice would never be served for the 5 women whose lives had been snuffed out with such savage brutality. Mary and Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly had become footnotes in history, their names remembered not for who they had been in life, but for how they had died at the hands of a monster whose identity would remain forever shrouded in mystery. The psychological impact of the unsolved case rippled through British society like a stone thrown into still water. The Ripper murders had shattered the Victorian belief in the inevitability of progress and the triumph of civilization over barbarism. Here, in the heart of the world's greatest empire, a single individual had terrorized an entire district, murdered innocent women with impunity, and vanished into the night, leaving behind only questions and the growing understanding that evil could wear a human face while remaining fundamentally inhuman in its appetites and methods. The investigative techniques developed during the Ripper case would revolutionize criminal detection for generations to come. The use of photography to document crime scenes, the systematic collection and cataloging of evidence, and the development of criminal profiling all emerged from the desperate attempts to understand and capture history's most elusive killer. The Metropolitan Police, stung by criticism of their handling of the case, invested heavily in new forensic technologies and investigative methods that would eventually transform law enforcement into the scientific discipline it would become in the 20th century. But these advances came at a terrible cost, paid in the blood of women whose only crime had been their vulnerability in a society that offered them no protection and little hope. The Ripper had chosen his victims from among the most desperate members of Victorian society, women whose lives had been reduced to mere survival in the cesspit of Whitechapel's slums. Their deaths became a mirror that reflected the ugly realities of British society's treatment of its most vulnerable members, forcing uncomfortable conversations about poverty, prostitution, and the social conditions that had made the murders possible. The media coverage of the Ripper case established templates for sensationalistic crime reporting that would persist well into the modern era. The breathless headlines, the lurid descriptions of violence, and the transformation of a criminal investigation into public entertainment all originated with the newspaper coverage of the Whitechapel murders. Jack the Ripper became the first celebrity serial killer, his notoriety spreading far beyond the boundaries of London to capture the imagination of readers throughout the world. This media circus created a perverse form of immortality for the killer, ensuring that his name would be remembered long after his victims had been forgotten. The letters sent to newspapers and police during the investigation revealed the extent to which the case had captured public imagination and spawned a cottage industry of hoaxers and attention seekers. Of the hundreds of letters received claiming to be from Jack the Ripper, only a handful were considered potentially genuine by investigators, while the rest represented a cross-section of Victorian society's mentally disturbed and criminally minded individuals who sought to insert themselves into the narrative of terror that had gripped London. The phenomenon of false confessions and hoax communications would become a permanent feature of high-profile criminal investigations, complicating police work and muddying the waters of justice. The geographic spread of copycat killings inspired by the Ripper murders demonstrated the global reach of the case's influence. From New York to Australia, disturbed individuals sought to replicate the Whitechapel killer's methods, often with horrifying success. These imitation murders, while lacking the surgical precision and systematic escalation that characterized the original crimes, shared enough similarities to suggest that the Ripper's techniques had become a template for a new kind of criminal behavior that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. The transformation of Whitechapel itself in the aftermath of the murders reflected the lasting impact of the terror that had gripped the district. Properties associated with the killings became macabre tourist attractions, drawing visitors who sought to experience a vicarious thrill by walking in the footsteps of history's most notorious killer. The commercial exploitation of the murders began almost immediately, with enterprising guides offering Ripper tours that promised to reveal the secrets of the case while sensationalizing the suffering of the victims and their families. The failure to catch Jack the Ripper had profound implications for public trust in law enforcement and the British justice system. The image of Scotland Yard as an efficient and competent investigative force suffered irreparable damage, replaced by a perception of bumbling incompetence that would dog British police for decades to come. The case became a symbol of institutional failure, proof that even the most advanced law enforcement techniques of the era were helpless in the face of a sufficiently clever and determined criminal. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Ripper case had evolved from criminal investigation to cultural phenomenon, inspiring countless books, plays, and eventually films that would cement the killer's place in popular culture. The historical Jack the Ripper became overshadowed by his fictional representations, each new interpretation adding layers of mythology that further obscured whatever truth might have existed beneath the surface of the investigation. The real women who had died became props in increasingly elaborate narratives that transformed their killer into everything from a supernatural entity to a misunderstood antihero, robbing them of dignity even in death. The medical and psychological theories that emerged from attempts to understand the Ripper's motivations laid the groundwork for the modern science of criminal psychology. The systematic study of the killer's methods, the progression of his crimes, and the apparent satisfaction he derived from mutilating his victims established patterns that would later be recognized as characteristic of what would come to be known as serial killing. The Ripper case provided the first detailed examination of a criminal who killed not for material gain or personal revenge, but for the pure satisfaction derived from the act of murder itself. The social reforms that eventually emerged from the publicity surrounding the Ripper murders represented perhaps the only positive outcome of the tragedy. The spotlight focused on Whitechapel's living conditions by the press coverage led to gradual improvements in housing, sanitation, and social services that might never have occurred without the international attention generated by the killings. The deaths of 5 women became a catalyst for changes that would improve the lives of thousands, though this progress came at a price measured in blood and suffering that no civilized society should have been willing to pay. The legend of Jack the Ripper had become larger than the man himself, assuming a life of its own that transcended the historical facts of the case. He had evolved from criminal to symbol, representing humanity's capacity for evil and society's vulnerability to predators who operated outside the normal boundaries of human behavior. The name Jack the Ripper entered the language as shorthand for ultimate evil, a bogeyman who haunted not just the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London, but the collective unconscious of civilization itself. In the end, the Ripper's greatest crime may not have been the murders themselves, but his successful escape from justice, leaving behind a mystery that would torment investigators and fascinate the public for over a century. He had proven that evil could triumph over good, that intelligence and preparation could defeat the forces of law and order, and that some questions would forever remain unanswered. The fog that had concealed his movements through Whitechapel streets had also shrouded his identity in mystery, creating a legend that would outlive any mortal man and establish Jack the Ripper as the archetypal serial killer whose shadow would fall across every similar case that followed. The terror he had unleashed in those few months of 1888 had fundamentally changed how society understood the nature of evil, creating a new category of criminal that would haunt the modern world. The serial killer who killed not from passion or profit but from a compulsion that existed beyond rational understanding. Jack the Ripper had opened a door that could never be closed, revealing depths of human depravity that civilized society preferred to believe did not exist. His legacy would live on in every darkened alley, every unsolved murder, and every moment when ordinary citizens wondered if the person walking behind them in the fog might be the next inheritor of his bloody crown. The Whitechapel murders had ended, but the age of terror they had inaugurated was just beginning. Jack the Ripper had vanished into history, but he had left behind a template for evil that would inspire countless imitators and establish a new paradigm for criminal behavior that would define the darkest aspects of human nature for generations to come. In the end, He had achieved a form of immortality that no ordinary mortal could claim. He had become fear itself, given form and substance, walking eternally through the nightmares of a world that would never forget the autumn when death stalked the streets of London and evil wore a human face. Thank you for watching and joining us as we explored these chilling and mysterious stories. If you enjoyed the journey, be sure to like, subscribe, and share with others who love a good mystery. We appreciate you taking the time to be a part of this, and we'll see you next time for more gripping stories. Stay safe and stay curious.